candidates for judicial postings will have to submit applications and be nominated to run in an election by evaluation committees within the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, all of which are controlled by the governing party. While AMLO urges that the judicial reform will bring more direct democracy to Mexico, in practice, it concentrates power in the executive and reduces the checks and balances that are so necessary to sustain a democracy. Mexico's judicial system is plagued with corruption, high impunity rates, inadequate resources and trainings, and is in need of reform, though the question remains if the reform approved in Congress is the right one for Mexico's democracy. The judicial reform poses a serious risk, as I said, for Mexico's democracy and will directly impact U.S. and private sector interests. Several other reforms that I previously mentioned would directly violate the United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement, known as the USMCA, making the 2026 review process of the USMCA that more difficult. With these reforms, Mexico could lose its economic position as the U.S.'s top trading partner and as a strategic partner in North America, risking its ability to reap the benefits of nearshoring. The Mexico Institute has launched a collection page on Mexico's constitutional reforms, which includes in-depth expert analysis and outlines what each constitutional reform entails and how several of these could violate the USMCA and hurt Mexico's relationship with the United States. We invite you to visit this collection page on the Mexico Institute's webpage. Today's event will focus on discussing and analyzing Mexico's constitutional reforms and their implications to the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. We have an incredible lineup of experts that will share their insights on the judicial reform, the electoral reform, the reform to eliminate independent agencies, as well as many others. We are deeply grateful to all of our experts and speakers for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. There are printed agendas on the table outside of the auditorium, and our virtual guests can find an electronic version of the agenda on the Mexico Institute's website, which includes the bios of all the speakers. We also have simultaneous translation available for both our in-person and virtual guests. For those of you that are here, you can find the translation equipment outside of the auditorium. And for our virtual viewers, you can, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should see an image of a globe. If you click on the globe, you can choose the language of your preference. Towards the end of each panel, we will take questions from the audience. In-person attendees can raise their hands and a microphone will be brought to you. For those online, if you would like to submit a question to our panelists, please send them to our X account at Mexico Institute or to our email, mexico@wilsoncenter.org. We will also take a break from 3:20 to 3:35, so please feel free to serve yourself and pastries right outside the auditorium. Just kindly ask you to
impact on Mexico's democracy. We might have the obligation of remembering September 11 as a turning point in Mexico's democratic history. So we will have today the participation of three experts on Mexico's legal and judicial structure, three experts that have not only studied the judicial structure of Mexico, but that have also a great experience inside the judicial system. Information, you have it in your notes, and I will turn the microphone to Francisca Poe, who is now a researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas at the Legal Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas of the National University. Welcome, Francisca. Great to see you.
Thank you, Jesus. Great to see you as well, and thanks to the Wilson Center for this invitation. It is indeed a sad day today in Mexico. On June the 3rd, the day after the election that, as Lisa was saying, gave this landslide victory to Morena, we were all watching President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum, whom we considered a more even and rational individual than the person that has occupied the presidency these last 6 years. And indeed, her first declaration on the issue was that the judicial reform deserved a very quiet consideration, not a hasty one. The following day, however, she was severely reprimanded by President López Obrador, and he said that the passing of Plan C was the main popular mandate of the election. And as we know, from that point on, it became all too clear that López Obrador had this single overwhelming goal, desire, before leaving the presidency, to pass the judicial reform and, if possible, the rest of the main reforms in the package of 20 bills he submitted to Congress on February the 5th, including the electoral reform, the reform disappearing the majority of independent agencies, and the bill placing the National Guard under full military control. The lame duck president was not planning to be lame at all. He was determined to write some additional chapters in this script of autocratic legalism that has been unfolding in Mexico over the last years, to the dismay of many people, me among them, that voted for a progressive platform in 2018. The grand finale of López Obrador is this judicial reform, a radical overhaul which stands out for its total disconnection with any sort of agenda bound on strengthening democracy and the rule of law. The judicial reform will destroy the independence and the capacity of the Mexican judiciary, and will erase the significant advancements, not enough, but significant, done over the last 30 years. And it will be in the Constitution, not in statutes, so it will likely affect Mexico for many years to come. It will be bad for the economy, it will be bad for the political system, but above all, it will be very bad for people. So let me underline very briefly 4 main points of what the reform does. First, the reform does not address any of the elements that cause problems in the Mexican system of administration of justice, not a single one of them. These problems exist despite the advancements. Of course, these problems exist, and from the university,
recording in progress,
and from civil society and from the university, we have spent decades pointing out what was the agenda that we had to urgently push forward in Mexico. Insufficient access to justice for people, complexity of the proceedings, starting with amparo, prosecutorial offices that are machines of rights violations, unprepared and immensely ineffective police bodies that breed corruption, state judiciaries that are still not independent enough. And it was painful to see that politically this reform was presented to the people as the magic solution to all these problems, when the fact is that nothing in the content of the reform addresses any of them, and it creates new ones that will be fatal for democracy. Lies being repeated 100 times to willing ears, and the mocking of a progressive agenda have destroyed, I think, our spirits these last weeks. Second, the reform is extraordinarily radical because it affects all judges in the country, federal judges, state judges, electoral judges. And it mandates, that's another thing that from a comparative point is very remarkable, a total replacement in only 2 single episodes, one in June 2025 and another one in June 2027 with the intermediate election. It does not devise a gradual replacement by, for instance, lowering the retirement age. This is, unprecedented also, the radicality of the total move, I think, in the comparative sphere. The Mexican government has accused the US of double standard in view of the fact that many state judges in the US are popularly elected. But this criticism forgets that in the US, the power of state judges is extraordinarily constrained by stare decisis, a very stabilized legal system, a strictly adversarial system with juries that leave the state judge in a position of a mere referee. It's very different. These judges, moreover, are elected in the US in the context of a system in which there are only a few candidates in every district with identifiable ideas, agendas, and bios, which the people can evaluate. Not to mention the fact that the prosecutor in the US, for all the problems, is well organized and has incentives to be effective. In Mexico, by contrast, the judges will be elected from lists that in some cases will have hundreds of names, in the context of an extraordinarily complex legal system in which the judge has an important number of individual powers, and against the background of almost total social and political control of organized crime in part of the territory. We know what happened in the last municipal election with the selection of the municipal candidates. Third, the reform eliminates the independence of the judiciary, of course, and subordinates judges to the political majorities of the day that will not always be of Morena, both ex ante and ex post. Ex ante because you will need political support to get into the lists that must be generated by the executive, the legislative, and the Supreme Court, which will be also popularly elected and therefore captured very soon. After a revision of merits that has absolutely de minimis, the politicians will determine the position one holds in the ballot list, and they will have to support the candidates in these political campaigns. Ex post, they will be able to control the judges elected for only 9 years through this new institution created by the reform, the Court of Judicial Discipline, which can act on request of any authority or any individual at any point, and can investigate on ill-defined terms that habilitate the political use of this court to curb disturbing injustices. The members of this court will also be elected and will have sanctionary powers with, it's not true that there's a possibility of appeal, there's an appeal, but it will be decided by the plenary of the discipline court instead of the section. Fourth, and finally, and Jesus, this is the fourth point, the reform will generate a judiciary with unprofessional individuals who will create a chaos and will force, I think, to resort to arbitration to those who can afford it, of course. It will have a very blatant adverse selection effect and will leave Mexico with very weak technical capacities in the judiciary. I think few people with the professional and the human capacities to be a judge will be willing to endure what it will take to get to the lists, what it will take to survive these campaigns, what it will take to survive the espada de Damocles of the disciplinary court. So the improvements of the judicial career in Mexico that have been real will be erased, and it's not true that everything was nepotism and was corporativism, it was everything. And this reform will destroy all these advancements and leave a system very weak in a context in which, as we know, we have very factical problems of control of illegal agents. So this is my my initial remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gisca, for this brilliant and compact overview of the consequences, the possible consequences of this judicial reform. I will now leave the microphone to Maria Amparo Hernandez. She's a judge at the Federal Circuit. Maria Amparo, nice to hear from you.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for the invitation to the Wilson Center for being here, and very honored to be sharing this space with you. Well, yes, as Francisco was saying, today is a very sad day. It was a very difficult night for us. It is very difficult for me to be here right now, knowing that after what happened last night, my days and the days of many of all of the Mexican judges are counted. So I'll make my best effort to give you my take on what's happening with the judicial reform. I don't think I have to repeat what has been said about the contents of the judicial reform. I believe that with what has been said the minutes before, we have an oversight, a very good oversight of what happened this week with the judiciary in Mexico. But I'd like to stress a point that hasn't been said, and it's not only and it's very worrisome. It's worrisome not only because of the contents of the judicial reform that have already been described, but I think that what happened on the last weeks, and particularly what happened yesterday, the way it developed is also very worrisome. The way the legislative process was rushed, the way the dialogues were developed theatrically, the no reason deliberation, we can because we can, we do because we can. And yesterday, some things that happened, like cartel-like things, like disappearing senators and hours without knowing where their whereabouts, having to move the protests, the breaking into the Congress, the having to... All those things, I think, that also are very revealing. Not only are the contents of the judicial reform revealing, but the way it was developed over the last weeks, and particularly what happened yesterday and has been recorded in many media, is very worrisome. Because what happened seems to confirm many of the hypotheses that were discarded by the official reasons given to push the judicial reform, and seem to confirm the hypothesis that the rush is to close a cycle with a very strong concentration of powers, which is, of course, very worrisome. So today we wake up to a new reality that we must continue to try to understand, not only how we got here, but it's very difficult to, from right now, foresee where we will going. I'll try to concentrate the last minutes, but it was very important for me to stress that the way things developed is also very, very revealing. What's next? What's next after what happened yesterday? Well, I think we can resume it and keep rushing. Not only we rushed the last weeks, and we rushed last night, and we rushed last week at the House of Deputies and yesterday in the Senate, but we'll keep rushing. We'll keep rushing because today we're rushing the legislative, local legislative approvals. We'll be rushing the publication. And when all this is done, we'll be rushing the next election. Next election is supposed to be convened in a couple of weeks. And in a couple of weeks, it's very soon, and it's a very, very, very titanic election. In a couple of weeks, we are supposed to see the Senate convene for candidates to raise their hands and say who wants to be a judge in a system that will not have, by that time, of course, statute regulation that is already acknowledged by the Senate, who has drafted that will not be an impediment to get the election done. So what we have right now enacted in the Constitution will serve as a sole basis towards the election that is starting in a couple of weeks. We'll be convening for elections for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of federal judges of different levels, of different specialities, and experimenting, and I don't like the word, but I think that's what we're going to be confronting, a very big experiment, but in real life and with real consequences. Let me give you a contrast. When Mexico several years ago replaced its criminal justice system and more recently its labor justice system, it took years, very long years of preparation to get us starting in a new system. This is practically a total overhaul of the system that in a couple of weeks will be starting. Who will be our next judges? We don't know. We start a very, very bumpy road in totally uncharted territory because none of this, as you know, has been tried in any other country. Maybe we can see some similitude with something in Bolivia, maybe something with some state elections in the United States, but nothing of these dimensions have been tried in comparative law. So it is an experiment which cost will be on the country, on all of us. We will be starting in a few weeks this election. Who will be the candidates? We don't know. What we do know is that the standards have been lowered, for me, to a very worrisome manner, considering also the very poor control that in Mexico we have in our legal system education. It is very easy in Mexico to have a law degree. You can have a law degree in a couple of years with institutes that nobody knows, or they just popped up from one day to the other. And we've seen that from a long time ago, and we've seen that recently with persons that hold high office posts today. We will see many people trying to be a federal judge, a federal magistrate, an appeals court judge. And we will have, yes, they introduced in the process a technical committee that will evaluate. But let me tell you my reserve with that technical committee. You can put a technical committee or you can put whatever you want in the middle of the process, but we cannot change that the starting point and the deciding point for who gets on the ballot is a political decision taken by political bodies. So the technical evaluation, I don't see it can neutralize all of the problems that are, because the starting and the finishing point are political bodies. And let me tell you in contrast, we have 30 years in trial and error of exams on studying profiles on what are we going to ask candidates in very serious exams and rigorous process we have to go through to have this office. And it has been a very difficult road. And it has been a road in which there have been so many discussions of what is important that a candidate to judge proves that he knows and that what he can do or she can do before holding this office. And so today we're going to start in 15 days an election with technical committees that are going to be convened for 1 week to another with 5 persons named by we don't know who, with we don't know what profile, with who are going to ask the candidates what? It's very difficult for me to understand how a process of cumulative knowledge of 30 years will be able to flow and deliver satisfactory candidates in the few days that they will have to evaluate. I think that will be very, very difficult, and albeit that comes okay, then there will be the referendum, the lottery, or however you call it. Because if there is more demand than the post that there's an office or they can make the election manageable, all these candidates that pass the checklist will be in a lottery. So that makes it also very complicated. It's very difficult for me to foresee who will be in the ballot. Yes, judges like me that are now in office have been given we may call it an automatic pass to the ballot if we so decide to. But I find it very difficult to think that there will be many of my colleagues who want to be on that ballot. We have to take a personal decision if we want to compete, and we have to go to an election in which we know that we compete against a very long, maybe even more than 6-year long narrative, public narrative, that we are the villains of all the movies of what is happening and all the flaws that have in the Mexican system. I don't know how that will flow. That will be a decision each of us will have to take personally, but I think it will be very difficult for many of us to take the decision to be there, and it is not the automatic pass is only to the ballot. The possibilities of winning with all these adversities, I think, are very low. And let me also say this, I find this, well, very sad, because it's a lot of accumulated knowledge, a lot of accumulated experience with all the flaws and all the things we would have to get better at, that will be simply dumped and start again. The election, in its own words, will be a very complicated election. The election is to be organized once the Senate or all the powers that decide who goes to the ballot finish their job. Then we go to the INE. We'll be organizing the elections. INE, as surely all of you know, is a very professional body that is very professional at organizing elections, but INE has never organized one election of these characteristics, and it will be very difficult for reasons such small or objective as electoral geography. The electoral geography that INE is used to work is district. This is the circuit geography. That is not this. We're going to get to things like so asymmetric, like if I compete in the Mexico City, I will have to convince an electorate of millions and millions and millions, while there are others at hundreds or thousands of persons. The election, I believe, will be very complicated. It has not been fully regulated, and constitutionally, there will be no time to regulate it before it starts. Maybe some legislation can be done in the middle of the way, and we will go with candidates to campaigns that are not really campaigns. And why are they not campaigns? Because we cannot use public money, we cannot use private money, we cannot contract media, no public servant or political party can speak in favor or against anybody. We can debate, and debate with who? When I go to an election, if I were to be on a ballot, against who? Because I don't have any identified competitor, because I will be on a ballot with a list with a bunch of names in which I don't really know who I'm against it. And reasonably, what can I offer an electorate? I'll get everyone to jail. I'll never get anyone out of jail. I'll protect your rights. It's baffling. And finally, we'll get to electoral ballots nobody understands. I'll leave it to there. Just wanted to draw that complicated election.
Space for discussion for the panelists, but I will now turn to Jose Ramon Cosio.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jesus, and thank you to Chisca and Maria Amparo for these very sad but very deep comments. Mexico need a judicial reform. Of course, we need a judicial reform. Many of the people who are here in this auditorium know what exactly we need to do. Lynn, for example, Lorenzo, many of us work for many, many years about the diagnostic from what we need. But this reform is really, like Chisca, Maria Amparo, Jesus, and many others in my country said, it's really, really an abuse. It's really a lack of decency. This is my first statement. The reform have a lot of functional problems. It's impossible to do a good procedure to select the best people who know law, people who have a compromise with the law. The functional problems are really huge and are really crazy. Maybe in the next moment we can talk about these problems. But we have another, I think, main concerns. One of them is, like many of you know, Mexico have really huge problems with the narcotraffic, with the gangs, and these gangs have a lot of intervention in our elections in the last years, not only in the last election, but for many years and in many elections. We have a concern about the possibility that a criminal gangs intervene in the decision on the selection and election of who will be judge. What happens if another countries to try to make a strong geopolitical decision in Mexico finance the election? What happens, for example, if Russia or China or Korea, North Korea, whatever, these kind of countries make financial investment in the Mexican election? This is another huge concern for me. And the third one, and maybe the most important, is if the judges will be elected, they erase the mediation between the law and the decision. When I was in the Mexican Supreme Court, I decided a lot of cases like Maria Amparo, like Chisca, and many other people here or in the Zoom. We take decision not by our own preferences. We take decision because the legislators put that decision in the law. In many cases, I disagree with the decision of the representatives or the Senate of my country. For example, in many cases, but only when they act in a very unconstitutional way, I need to accept the decision of the legislators. Maybe crazy, maybe not so good, but is a commitment that I have because they are the representatives of the people. But what happens when the judges and the representatives of the Senate have the same legitimacy? This is for me the most important question. When the judge said, well, I have exactly the same legitimacy that you have the legitimacy. This is a very important concern, not is a philosophical concern and theoretical point, is for me the most important question. I think that the movement, and especially the next president, Dr. Sheinbaum, don't understand exactly this change of point. She have a movement. She win the elections by herself, not by the mediation of López Obrador. What happened in the next months, years? The judges said, well, I have exactly, and I, sorry for repeat my idea, I have exactly the same legitimacy that you have the legitimacy. Why I, like a judge, need to accept the decision that the members of the Congress put in this or that law? I think this is a very complex operation of the law. If you have judges elected by the money from the gangs, from another countries, if you have the new judges in general, who have very little experience, like Chisca and Maria Amparo said, the people who have only 18 years, the president reduced the age. Now in Mexico, you need to have around 20 years and for be a judge and 25 to be a justice. He reduced the age, and he have the possibility to very young people without any experience will be judge in this procedure. For me, this is the most important question. And in the next year, I suppose that we have a lot of changes in the stability of the judicial system, in the interpretation of the laws, in this kind of relation between the new judges and his own electorate. Because you need to sell something to the people who don't know you, and you need to sell something. It's not possible that say, well, if I will choose like George, I apply the law. Well, it's a very bad offer, no? Everyone try to apply the law. What do you need to listen from me to vote for me? Because I am the most radical feminist judge in the whole country. I am the most conservative judge in the most country. What do you need to identify me, first of all, and finally vote for me? If I have the same legitimacy that the members of the Congress. This is my most concern that I of course agree with Maria Amparo and Chisca.
Thank you very much, Jose Ramon. I think that there are several things that we can discuss in the following minutes. I think one of the most dramatic things that we've been hearing in the last minutes is the depth of the experiment, the size of the experiment, how this judicial reform does not have any precedent in Mexican history or in the world history, that we are going to radically change the judicial system without a real diagnosis, without identifying what are the real problems of the judicial system. And I would like to ask you, what do you think might be the problems in the implementation of this judicial reform? I think that we have to imagine what a chaotic way to what is the symbol and the sign that Mexico is delivering to its own people, to its citizens, and also to the world. So I don't know if anyone of you would like to address the complexities, the challenges of implementing what has already been approved by Mexican Senate. Chisca? I don't know if...
About implementation, maybe Maria Amparo and Jose Ramon have more of a cue in terms of what happened in the judiciary. But I think what Jose Ramon said is very important and will also create problems for the implementation. I mean, President Sheinbaum will have to deal with gigantic problems in every dimension of political and social life, right? The economy, the militarization, whatever. But one of these problems is dealing with the divisions and all the strife that will be going on in Morena, right? And so imagine that, as Jose Ramon says, you will have these judges that understand themselves in a populist key or in a militant key, or that, you know, that it is another political actor in the table confronting the others and saying, you know, you have this mandate, you are not, because in the traditional model, a judge legitimizes itself by way of reasons, by the way she justifies or whatever. So I think one of the complexities of the implementation, beyond the technical things that my colleagues can expand on, will be this political strife within the now hegemony to select the candidates, and ultimately, I think this can lead to a scenario of very difficult governability for the president, because in political, we are lawyers, but we are in dialogue with political scientists all the time. And we all know that, in fact, presidents need the judiciary to govern. Because, I mean, this is from the beginning when, when kings in the Middle Ages, created the judiciaries, it was because they cannot do all the time. They need instances to deal with social problems. They need implementation, not only, and Claudia Sheinbaum recites a very weak public administration, right? So now the other structure that helps govern a country, the judiciary, will also be very weak, and will be amid this strife between different sections in the political majority that is now hegemonic. So this is not the technical side, but I see this coming as well.
Thank you.
Well, I can add that I see a very complicated short-term and long-term scenario. We've been already talking about some of the very complicated issues that will rise operatively in the election, but let's get a fast forward, and we got through the election in some way. In a way, I think the electorate will not even have clear how the ones that did get won the election will get to their post, but I'll fast forward to the day that September 1, which is when we were supposed to be changing everything. I think we don't have to be a sorcerer to see that it is a very uncertain, and I don't like to use this word, but I think it is pertinent in this moment, chaotic scenario, because in 1 year from now, we'll be totally replacing the top governing bodies, Supreme Court, Consejo de la Judicatura, no more Consejo de la Judicatura. We'll have two other, the disciplinary court, which has its own problems. We'll have a new administrative body. We'll have new circuit court, circuit judges, district judges, and we'll be from 1 year to now wiping out and beginning with new people that will have their own learning curve in the job, in the top governing bodies, in the top bodies of the judiciary, and also all the way down. Maybe during some years, 2 years only, until the next election in 2027, things can get a little neutralized by the other half that will still be there, but I think it is very difficult to start something so experimental in that dimension, and at the same time restarting with the top bodies and the low bodies. I think that it will have so many uncertainties, along with all the operative problems we will have during the process, that we will start from now till September 2025, but from 2025 on, things will be very uncertain, complicated, and let me say these things. Let me say something. For a justice system to work, you need many things, many pieces working together and working each one. It's like a clock with its machinery. You need good laws, you need good infrastructure, you need good human talent, you need lots of things. But one thing that, even if all the rest are okay, if you don't have good judges, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And we had many things that we had to get better at in our judiciary system. And the one thing that was not that worse, of course it had flaws, it could have gotten better, we wiped it out. And we're starting from zero again in one of the most important elements of a judicial machinery. So that makes me think uncertainty will be here for a long time.
Thank you. José Ramón.
Yes, Well, there are different kinds of problems on different levels. For example, the reduction to the numbers of the justices to 11 to 9 is incredible, a bad idea. And the cancellation over from the two chambers to the operation in only one organ is impossible. It's impossible to resolve the many cases that the Supreme Court have each year, for example. The second one is much more complex, and you know very well these problems. Mexico started a huge criminal reform that finished in last years, but we start to commercial changes in the procedural system, labor system, civil systems, and familiar systems. You in this very moment you have the translation to the whole procedures to a new ways of resolution. This is about the 18 or 90% of all the cases in the Mexican system. You have the criminal, the commercial, etc. And in this very moment, you try to change the organization of the judicial branch. It's impossible because you need in this moment to transform the procedures. They are very sophisticated. For me, when I was in the Supreme Court, my main concern, and Chisca and Maria Amparo was there in those years, was the made a compatibility between the criminal procedures and the juicio de amparo. It's very complex. For me, this probably is the most challenge moment in the Supreme Court. Now you need to make this kind of arrangement in a moment when you change the whole judicial branch. It's impossible. You need a very sophisticated knowledge to try to make this kind of arrangement. For example, it's only one aspect that we don't. This is not very common to say this question. The other, for example, is of course the intervention of the gangs, the other things. But this one is a technical problem, and you know the law or you don't know the law, and you create a crisis, and of course you make a lot of harm in the common population.
Thank you. And I even would say from a citizen's perspective that it's difficult to argue how this reform would empower citizens, because we are going to vote blindfolded. We don't know who the candidates are. We don't have any clue what is the record. And we will basically have three parties that nominate candidates that are the president's party, the Congress party, that are the same party, and then we will have a judicial party that will become more and more of the same party of the president and Congress. We have already, we've been receiving already questions from the audience, and I will start by asking one interesting question to the panel. Will it be a selection process or an exclusion process? One process that has the intention to get rid of anyone that's not okay for the new regime, to hold absolute control over the process to build the new judiciary. Is this some type of a purge of the judiciary, or it's a selection of new judges? And then I will also ask an interesting thing that Jose Ramon talked about a minute ago. Will the election of judges by popular vote open the door for further influence on behalf of organized crime in Mexico's judicial system? I don't know if anyone will like to start with each of these questions. So, is it a hiring process or a purge of uncomfortable judges?
it will be the two, right? Because, I mean, when the process starts, the self-selection, as Maria Amparo said, many people will not want to participate. And maybe some candidates that plan to be independent will say, yes, no, let's do it. Let's try. So they will maybe get into the list and some of them will get elected, but then they will be able to be purged by the disciplinary court, right? So it is a very interesting question because ex ante and ex post, many different things can happen. But I don't think, I mean, I am taking a break from optimism. I always try to see whether the system can in some ways end it up like working well. No, what I see, because we are not only seeing the judicial reform, this is part of a broader pattern, right? So I think this will be a selection. Some of them will be, like I want you in the list, whatever. And in the other people that self-postulating, if they are troubling, they will be it will be possible to purge them through the disciplinary court. That I think it's one of the most worrying dimensions of the design.
Maria Amparo, I think it's a dramatic and a terrible ethical dilemma to participate in the new process or not. What do you think about these professional ethical dilemmas?
Well, as you say, it is a difficult and personal decision that all of us will have to take. Of course, we are a very numerous group, and there are many different mindsets in the group. But my take on it is that there will be a large number, particularly in the federal system, that, as you see, as everybody saw in the last weeks, are very convinced that this is not a system that will work and that has more inconveniences than any advantage, if any, it has. I think that at the federal level, there will be a low participation. Of course, we all have families to feed, and maybe that will be on the radar, but it will be, for some, an easy decision because it's a no-no from now, and for some it may be a more difficult decision because you also know what you're going into. And as Chisca said, the first thing, maybe we don't have to fight for being in the ballot because we have been given an automatic pass, but we know what we will be confronting, and we know that if we have been uncomfortable or if we have been mentioned for a decision that was not liked during this term, it's almost a new possibility of getting there. And my take on it is that on the local level, the dynamic will be different. Local judges have different dynamics, different ways of getting to the job and different ways of working. Maybe at the local level, it's a different dynamic and it won't be such a difficult or such an easy decision. But I have heard a lot of no-nos, and I can understand them. And for me too, it's a difficult decision because most of us do this because it's our vocation. We've prepared ourselves 10, 20 years to being here. We strive to do it every day better. We study, and it's very difficult to find what's next for us. But, well, that's just my story, and every judge will have his or her story.
And politics as a vocation is a very different thing as judging as a vocation.
Yes.
No, and again, think in this situation. You arrive early at the casilla, ¿cómo dirías?
Ballot box?
Ballot box, at the ballot box.
Ballot
Okay.
station.
You receive the ballot with 6 names. By choose between the 6 names the first administrative court of the first circuit. You have 6 names. Well, you choose, for example, Jesus is very good candidate. And you, Mark, you put on the side the ballot from the first administrative court, and you take the ballot to the second administrative court of the first circuit with another 6 names, and you repeat the same operation many times. How kind of information you can have in that moment? Mm-hmm. You can't vote for a party, of course. You say this candidate is from PRI or PAN or Moreno or whatever. No, it's impossible. What is your information? Oh, this guy was nominated by the president. Mm-hmm. Well, it's possible that the president have the whole nomination because the Congress have a very bad reputation, and yesterday is worse, with the acts of yesterday was worse, and the Supreme Court is under attack for many years. Who will vote for a candidate who came from the Supreme Court? It's impossible. Mm-hmm. The president will win the whole nomination because it's an economy of information. You don't know. This is a very huge concern. And of course, what happened if Claudia Sheinbaum don't have the power to make for his own and the member of his own team, the Secretary of Gobernación or whatever, the selection of the names. What happened? It's an hypothesis. If López Obrador or anyone in the government make the selection of the people who have 18 years, who have average of the studies, don't have experience. Mm-hmm. That is my concern.
We have time for a couple of questions from the room. I would ask you to be very brief so that we can have the more questions possible. Who has the microphone over there?
Lynn.
Oh,
no,
Lynn.
Mucho de Mexico.
Okay. There are so many details that I find the whole thing so depressing. It's like trying to argue with Vladimir Putin as to whether he should have invaded or not. I think it's a bad idea. It could have been worked out. I mean, there's no reason that elected judges might not work if you plan this adequately, and it's not. But I guess I'm going to ask one more question of detail, and I embarrassingly have not read the reform, so I don't know whether this detail was covered. But can anyone just raise their hand and say, I want to be on the Supreme Court, or I'm going to be an appellate judge, or I'm going to, there's nothing. I think one of the things we can hope, because I saw this happen in Peru when they were going to elect all the jueces de paz and then found out it was just too difficult. But it's maybe unworkable because there's not enough of a plan, but we'll see. But anyway, can you, I guess Jose Verón has already said, yes, if I want to be on the Supreme Court, I can put my name in.
Well, we know of 2 judges that have been that have publicly decided to run for office. That one of them initiated her campaign saying, "I was a founder of Morena. I'm very proud of supporting López Obrador. Vote for me." That was the start of her campaign.
Oh, can I add for the non-Supreme Court justices? It looks like this is a very interesting question about the details. Yes, because it looks like in the Chamber of Deputies they introduced this tombola thing, this draw thing, this I don't know if I translate well, tombola. So it looks like one will be able to raise her hand and said, I am interested in sending the CV. And then there are very low requirements, like having a letter from your neighbors And this apparently will be in the Constitution. I mean, it's not a joke. They put that in the Chamber of Deputies, and to have an aid of a grade 8, which in Mexico, as my colleague said, it's relatively easy because there's no regulation of the profession or the law schools or whatever. And then, but then the iniciativa say, well, if there's too many candidates with these minimal qualifications, then we will have a draw. And then I have the problem that I don't know with this, that after the draw, whether the politicians will pick up, so there are details that are not really clear as with regards self-postulation, the draw. And for instance, what position will you occupy in the list of candidates? It's not the same to be the second than to be, the 20 or to be the... So this is, yeah, we still don't know, but it doesn't look like very, we don't know. It's part of the uncertainty of this thing.
Can I go first now? Okay. Given the rejection, strong universally rejection that we have seen as a reaction to the reform as it regards to the USMCA, my question is, are there any chances that it could be fixed, the things that are affecting more investment in the compliance with the USMCA in the discussions of the secondary laws?
Well, of course, many of you, all of you knows that the election in Mexico excuse me, I come back and immediately I come back with your question. In Mexico, we don't have juries. And because we don't have juries, we don't have verdicts. And for that reason, the judge or the judges are in all liberty to decide whatever that means. It's very important because many people say, well, what's the problem in the United States? Chisca talking about this problem. But many people say, what? This is not really a big problem because in the United States, the many judges was or are elected. This is important. And the second one, I really don't know. This is Fitch. Subscribe a report in July, in the last days of July, I don't remember exactly the date, and said that one of the main concerns about Mexico is Petróleos Mexicanos, and the other one is the judicial reform. And in the next days, with the draft of the diputados, the representatives, we receive really a lot of questions about the possibilities to the investment in Mexico. I don't know exactly what is the moment, but you are very well informed that we have a lot of concerns in the investment in the funds, etc. No, I think we'll have a lot of repercussions.
Can I add something?
Fernández Noroña, the actual president of the Senate, said, maybe it's possible that Mexico receive a harm in the investment, but the people vote for us. It's the decision from the people. This is the kind of responsibility.
Maria Amparo, you wanted to add something?
Just a small thing to the last question. What can be fixed in the secondary laws? I think a few things can be fixed, because what happened this week is we had, like we ordinarily do, a very dense constitutional text reform. So many things are very detailed in what was enacted yesterday. So can something be fixed? Well, some voids can be filled, some details can be detailed, but the basics, the basic working of this new scheme is already set out and is already practically already enacted. So the space, the margin, the space that it's fixed in the sense that it can't be moved. And so can we fix what is fixed? Some things can be detailed, but it's very improbable that we can change the structural things that were enacted. And for an example, related to the other question, can anybody raise their hand? Well, of course, not anybody, but the standard is so low that many people can raise their hands. And as Chisca was saying, what has been enacted to the Constitution? That you have to have a school average of 8, maybe in US it would be like a C plus, B minus. That's enacted to the Constitution. The grade that you have to have in your law school. What's enacted also to the Constitution? That you have to have letters of reference, and the letters of reference or letters of recommendation can come from your neighbors. That's enacted into the Constitution. Can that be fixed in the secondary laws? That can be detailed. Maybe they can put a geometrical requirement for who is signing the letter of recommendation, or something that you met in law school. Someone you met in law school has to sign it. That can be detailed, but everything has been put in constitutional text. I suppose that thinking that this would blind from constitutional control the system that's being enacted. And what can happen on the USMCA scenario? Well, I believe that takes us to two different settings. One setting in which conflicts that may arise in trade issues are private party issues, and may be arbitrary, and may be solutioned by private practice or private justice that will, I believe, take traction as a good way to solve conflicts when you don't have a functional judiciary system. But there are things that cannot be arbitrated, and that will be a hardcore things we will have to deal with. Expropriations cannot be arbitrated. Tax issues cannot be arbitrated. You have a tax problem with the tax authority, and you will have to pass through this new judiciary. You have an expropriation problem, you will have to pass through this judiciary. You have a regulatory problem that is a very big issue in energetics, in telecom, in competence, economic competence, monopolies, antitrust. That cannot be arbitrated. That has conflicts that have to pass through this new judiciary with same procedural laws, same substantive laws, but the people operating it are going to be practically new. So some things can be detailed, but many things cannot be fixed. Sorry.
No, and I agree, of course, with Maria Amparo, but I need to say the same ideology that rejects the judicial independence is the same ideology that rejects the arbitration or the private resolution of conflicts. It's the same.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for a very, very brief question. Over there.
Thank you very much. Just my question is, Jose Ramon mentioned something about these technicalities that judges will face with this new judicial system, not judicial, but labor system and civil system law. But my question is, we are just facing a new judicial reform or a new regime that actually rejects the rule of law in Mexico. So I think this is my question for the panel.
Wow. No, I really don't know, because who are the people, and Maria Amparo said, who are the people who will be in the ballot? For example, you? No. Okay. I suppose that your answer. Who? You know that in Mexico we have 2,000 schools of law, many of them, the huge majority of them, very, very bad schools of law. And you need only have 18 years, finish your study, and have an average about 8. I don't know what is the correspondence here in the United States, but it's 8.
A C
It's
plus or
C plus or something like that. It's really a weak possibility. And the other question is the same question. If you don't know anyone in the profession because you don't need to know it, how do you identify them? How he or she combines you? And who finance this person to be in the ballot with your vote is really very, very dangerous. And in this moment, we have and the penetration of the gangs, many other problems in the country.
Well, thank you very much. I think that after hearing Chisca, María Amparo, José Ramón, we have a clear notion of why September 11 of 2024 will be a day to remember in Mexico's history and why it is going to be remembered as a very sad day in Mexico's democracy. But there's room for optimism. We are having a panel on electoral reform. In a couple of minutes, we will discuss what is ahead in terms of elections in Mexico. Thank you very much. Sí.
por varias cosas y personas, pero listo. Okay, hello. Good afternoon. I'm Blanca Heredia. I'm moderating this panel. In case you were breathing and gotten kind of at ease, we have some more stuff for you to get excited or thinking about how one can change so many pieces of a country in such little time. I'm honored to have been invited to moderate this panel with few people in the world really know so much about this matter than the ones here. Luis Carlos Ugalde and Lorenzo Córdoba were both presidents of the Instituto Nacional Electoral, and Ciro Murayama was part of the general council of that institute. They worked for many years in that institution, which is at the center of Mexico's institutional setup in electoral matters. As you all know, Mexico is, let me say, one of the few, I believe it's the only one, but let's say one of the few countries that went from an electoral authoritarianism to a full-fledged pluralist electoral, fully competitive democracy. Mexico was a precursor of a type of regime that has become more common past few years, which is an electoral authoritarian regime. That is one that has elections regularly, even though they're not necessarily free and fair. Might seem like a minor point, but in my understanding, many of the complexities of our institutional system in the electoral field, the one that makes it possible and has made it possible since the late 90s to move from non-free and fair elections to free and fair elections, was an extremely complicated process, both politically, because there needed to be a situation where the dominant party found it to be in its interest to relinquish the control of electoral processes, but also in terms of design, because as I see it, the most important thing that needed to be addressed is how do you make elections that have lost, if ever had any credibility, how do you make them credible again? And at the center of that whole complex system stands the Instituto Nacional Electoral, the electoral body, the one that organizes elections and counts votes, and the part of the judiciary that adjudicates conflicts, Tribunal Electoral. This panel then will be discussing a reform that was part of the package that Andrés Manuel López Obrador announced on in February of this year that he wanted to pass. It would be a constitutional reform that essentially, well, changes many crucial aspects of this institutional setup. To begin with, instead of the current way in which the maximum decision body of the Instituto Nacional Electoral is selected, they would also be elected by popular vote. Then I'll just mention the most important ones. Today in the Chamber of Deputies, we have 500 deputies. That initiative is proposing that we move to only 300, eliminating the proportional representation, 201 seats. And the Senate, the same. Only it would reduce it to 1/3 of its current number, and many other aspects. But already, with the judicial reform, a crucial part of this whole institutional arrangement, the Tribunal Electoral, has been touched. So now, the last thing I want to say, just as context, is that this particular constitutional initiative, reform initiative, is the only important one, crucial one, that will not be, in principle, approved this month of September. President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum announced that this reform in particular needed additional work, and that she would present it once she becomes president in this it's unclear exactly when, but in any event, it's not part of the same package of which the judicial reform is part, or the incorporation of the Guardia Nacional to the military structure, and many others. This one was pushed a bit to the future. So without further ado, let me start this panel with the following question. A question for Ciro Murayama. Minority representation in Mexico's transition to democracy was extremely important. What are the risks of reducing, or in fact eliminating, minority representation, which is part of the wording of the proposed initiative as it originally was drafted by Andrés Manuel López Obrador and publicized in February?
Thank you, Blanca, and thank you to the Wilson Center. Yes, how is a very important question, because we have to ask us how Mexico was able to leave behind the authoritarian regime that had almost all the 20th century to become a democracy. And one of the key of that change was the building space to the representation of the real plurality of the Mexican society in the Congress. You can see in the imagine that before the 70s, Mexico has a very strong authoritarian system with the repression to the students in the movements in 1978, then in early 70s. And Mexico has a huge problems in political landscape with workers' union movements, the students' guerrilla, but the formal political system was back to the real political problems. We had just one candidate to the president in 1976. So after that, in 1977, it started with the first reform to the democratic opening, and the key of that reform was to create the proportional representation in the Congress. They reformed the Constitution to include 100 deputies elected by proportional representation, and there were also the 300 deputies elected in electoral districts. It was the beginning of the democratization to avoid, as the Minister of the Interior, Reyes Heroles, said, to avoid the Mexico Bronco, to avoid the wild and violent Mexico. Well, it was necessary to open the electoral arena, the electoral square, to attract the different real political groups as left or from the right. And it was a reality in the late 70s. In the 80s, there was another reform to expand the pluralism in the Congress with 200 deputies elected by representation way and 300 in the districts. And the democratic process continued until the 90s. There was a very important reform with a big consensus to limit the overrepresentation in the Congress and to change the Constitution to establish that was necessary a consensus to change the Constitution, because no one political party will be able to have more than 60% of the deputies, and you need 67% of the deputies to change the Constitution. So it was mandatory to build consensus to change the fundamental law of Mexico. After that reform, from 1997, the president lost for first time the control of the Congress and started the real division of powers in Mexico. For 20 years, we had no majority in the Congress, in the deputy chambers and in the Senate. And in the last 6 years, we have a simple majority of Morena in both chambers. But what are López Obrador proposing? To cancel the proportional representation. It means to go back before the start to the democratic process, to eliminate the right of fair representation of the minorities in the Congress, so the government will be able to change the Constitution at it will, as we saw last night, and is the end to the system that was built to reflect the real pluralism of Mexican society. It's closed the expression of the minorities, is to start to build another one and another regimen of hegemonic party. I think is a really bad idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ciro Murayama. A question for Lorenzo Córdoba. Could you please tell us what are the main ingredients of Mexico's institutional arrangements behind that have made it possible to conduct free and fair elections since the 90s? And in what ways does this reform initiative pose risks to this general arrangement?
Well, I think the aim behind well, I would like to thank also the Wilson Center for the invitation and, of course, to share this table with the dear friends and colleagues. The main aim, as I said, of this reform, according to me, is to get control on the electoral system, as well as it happens in the past times during authoritarian era in Mexico, in which the government has the control of the electoral bodies and therefore plays as well as a player and a referee. They were judging part of the electoral dispute, and I will explain why. But I think it's important to, in order to understand why this issue that usually happens in strong and old democracies, such as in the US. I mean, it's normal that in Europe, the electoral bodies or the electoral function is one of the Ministry of Interior powers. Why in Mexico we should invent a new electoral independent system as the basis of any free and fair and authentic, as the Constitution claims, elections. I would say, in order to understand the Mexican electoral system, what we have built in the last 30 years, is to understand that this is a system built in order to inoculate distrust. I mean, usually electoral system is based on trust as a value. Trust on what the electoral authority says, trust on what the results at the end of the election day says, and so on. In Mexico, I mean, the key point to understand the electoral system is that every improvement we have made in the last 30 years were made precisely in order to build trust in a very untrustable processes. And the main access to, in order to achieve that, were first create new institutions, autonomous from power and independent for political parties, in order to become a free and fair referee of the electoral contest. On second, in second place, to construct new rules, to establish new rules agreed by the general consensus, which is another characteristic. In Mexico, the transition was an agreed transition, as Just Blanca said in the introduction to this panel, among the parts. That means among the government, the ruling party, and both the opposition, and all the opposition parties. And the third, the idea was to clarify, you know, not only the rules, but also the way in which elections are organized and run off. So in order to inject a certainty in the electoral process. And the third main act is to create new procedures in order intended to inoculate distrust and improve credibility on institutions. So new institutions, new rules, and new procedures. What is the main problem of this electoral reform? And just answering the expectation that Jesus created about this panel, he said good news comes. Well, the only good news in this issue is that the electoral reform was postponed. But the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, the elected president, has already said, has already agreed with the contents, with the main contents. Yes, she said we need more discussion, but the main contents are already settled. And which one are those contents? And the most risky basic contents in order to, or according to, the trustability on one hand and the impartiality we have achieved in the actuation of the electoral bodies. Well, the first one is, as well as it happens in the judicial reform that we just analyzed in the past panel, is that all the authorities that will be responsible to run elections, both in the INE, which is the administrative body, the one who organizes, who has the role to become a referee in first instance between the contenders and so on, and also the electoral judges, the members of the electoral court in Mexico, will be elected. With all the risks we have already heard in the first panel, reproduces in here. Once again, if you want to, and I come to finish my first intervention, if you want to politicize some public role, elect it. I mean, inevitably, you will have people who will respond for the majority interests, the one who elect them, instead to become, an equidistant role among the contenders. And there are many other things. I think the main issue, in order to trust, that's what has to do with impartiality. But talking about trust, I think the reform intends to relax many of the regulations, which is not bad in first instance, but the problem is that the capabilities, the arbitrary decisions of the electoral bodies in order to impose penalties to those who infract the law, or to solve, the conflict between political parties will arise. And when you have more powers and a less regulation, in the case of Mexico, means more arbitrary decisions, which could affect in a very low loyalty democratic compromise, will affect the trustability in the whole electoral system.
Thank you to Lorenzo Cordova. He tells us, if I understand correctly, that the kinds of changes that are being proposed would place in question what would be the litmus test of electoral democracy, and that is the ability of parties that are currently not governing, their ability to, in free and fair elections, win the next election and become government. That would be unclear whether that kind of fundamental aspect of competitive electoral democracy, that's what's at stake, right, Lorenzo?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This question is for Luis Carlos Ugalde and brings it closer to where we're located physically, and is how would this changes in Mexico's institutional arrangements having to do with competitive elections, with free and fair elections, and electoral democracy more generally, what has democracy meant for U.S.-Mexico relations, and what would its end, let me put it that way, mean for U.S.-Mexico relations, and specifically for our trade relations in light of what is going to be the revision of the USMCA?
Thank you, Blanca. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to my friends. I think the relevant question for U.S. audiences and for the American public, or the American political public, is whether Mexico can continue to hold free and fair elections. That is the question. Aside from the electoral bill López Obrador introduced, this is the basic question. And how this may affect the U.S.-Mexico relation and the review of the USMCA in 2026. When NAFTA was negotiated in the 1990s, you may remember that many lawmakers in Washington questioned the undemocratic nature of the Mexican political system. In those years, many questioned the fraud that many elections in Mexico had. And it was in 1990, precisely in 1990, when IFE was created in Mexico by the administration of Carlos Salinas de Gortari. And that development, those developments in that decade helped Mexico to be perceived as a trusted partner in the North American treaty. When Fox won the presidency in 2000, I was working in Washington. I used to work at the Mexican embassy. I remember that may have been the highest point of Mexico in the perception of the American public, because now we were a democracy. Now in 2024, the perception of Mexico is weakening, not only because of this democratic backsliding, but mainly because of the drug trafficking problem and violence in Mexico. And many are becoming to question if Mexico can continue to be a trusted partner because of this backsliding. In the past few weeks, you have read many articles questioning the judicial reform, but a few voices begin to question this democratic backsliding. So the question is that maybe in 2026, the question would be if Mexico can protect the legal rights of companies operating in Mexico. And many may say that, well, if we don't have a democracy, that doesn't mean we cannot protect rights of foreign companies, for example. I was here in Washington, by the way, a few weeks ago in a conversation with some investors, and I was talking about the risk if Mexico had a judicial reform. And one investor, an Italian one, I remember, said, well, Luis, it wouldn't be bad if Mexican democracy take a sleep in the backseat. And because sometimes authoritarian regimes may be more able to promote investment and economic growth. And I said, well, in cases like Mexico, if democracy takes a break, then the system and the rule of law takes a break as well, because democracy is the political support of the rule of law. So I would say that the problem is that maybe the INE will be able to survive because it has to organize the election of judges. That is one of the reasons why this bill was taken away from the list of priorities, because of that. It may survive till 2027. Maybe many of the members of the board will be captured, but maybe it will survive in its logistical aspects and the structure that organize elections. That is good news. However, if this continues, Mexico will end up being able to organize free and fair elections, and we will become a competitive and authoritarian regime, but eventually this will disappear, I would say.
Thank you very much, Luis Carlos. I think we've touched upon, and our panelists have touched upon, each one of those questions would give us a lot of food for thinking and discussing, such as, for instance, how important is democracy for undergirding rule of law, and how those two things are important or not for investments and for investment decisions. We've heard for many years now that that is the case. But there's considerable empirical evidence that that is not always the case, China being the most obvious, glaring example. And it seems to me that at some point we need to take reality into account, because I think we've assumed that a set of things that have been said repeatedly over the past 20, 30 years are empirically true. And it's not always the case that they are. So I think that the kind of things that this Italian investor, and me talking to investors recently, and also some foreign governments in Mexico, I mean, this kinds of discussions are starting to get more complex. Let me now move to our second round of questions, if I may. Let me start off by providing a very, very brief presentation of what is the diagnostics. So how does the initiative originally presented by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, President of Mexico, in February of this year, what does he think, or the people that put together this initiative, this bill, thought needed to be straightened and put right about Mexico's electoral system? There's two main issues that the president has repeatedly argued are not well in our electoral setup, and that is cost, that the price of the electoral processes is very high, which we're going to hear more about, but generally the kinds of data that we know do indicate that Mexico is more expensive in terms of its electoral processes than many other countries. So, and this has been repeatedly said by the government and by many others, but especially by President López Obrador, for many, many years now. And people believe it. Second big question that, or defect, problem that Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his movement and the people that support him think that this institutional setup has, and it's that it's not fair. The evidence here is considerably less robust for this problem, but it's been insistently said the system has been accused of not being fair. And the main evidence, quote unquote, is the repeated allegation that Andrés Manuel won in 2006 and that his triumph was not recognized. And that's like the thing that Morena and Andrés Manuel López Obrador repeat, and many believe. But again, in contrast to the cost, where there are some, there is evidence that it is costly. In the case of it's unfair, there's no much evidence in that sense. There's no conclusive evidence. Of course, there's many things that could be done better, but overall, generally, I think general agreement, even among those that are not, that were not part of its design, that have never worked in any part of the system, agree that it is pretty fair. And to address these problems that the reform purportedly aims to address and correct, and any other problems, many of which are not even mentioned in this reform initiative, I want to start asking Ciro Murayama, how costly are Mexican elections? And is the solution proposed by this initiative adequate?
Thank you, Blanca. Well, first of all, I think, yes, López Obrador has insisted in the election in 2006, there was a fraud without any evidence. 18 years after that, he has not shown any evidence that supports his allegation, as Donald Trump will continue saying that the last election there was a fraud in the United States. The democracies are facing that kind of politicians. But about the costs, let's see. The average budget of the National Electoral Institute is 0.2% of the federal budget. If the federal budget is $500, the cost of the National Electoral Institute is $1. This is the cost, the relative cost to have an institution that gives to Mexico free and fair elections, and also gives another important good public, another important service that is the ID. The electoral ID is, in the fact, the identity card, citizen identity card in Mexico is free for all the citizens, and it is in the base of the really fair elections, because the census, of course, we have one of them. I don't bring mine because I don't want to lose it. But the emission of this ID and protect the personal data is 30% of the operational cost of the INE, each budget, every year. 1/3 of the cost, and is a public service. But let's see the INE budget from another point of view. According to the data provided by Carlos Ursúa, who was the first finance minister of López Obrador, the cost of cancel the international airport in Mexico City in 2018 was $15 billion just in that year. Is the budget of the INE since 2014 to this year, making elections every year, local elections, and federal elections every 3 years, is less the investment in INE and in the free and fair election, the cost, the budget is less than one decision taken by the president one day. So the INE and the democracy has a value. The authoritarian decision has a cost. Is the big difference. Have a professional body, as the INE is an investment for the peaceful change of government in Mexico, for trust in the possibility to make business in Mexico, but the authoritarian decision have very high costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ciro Murayama. I think he provides us with some interesting numbers to give us a sense of the size of the cost of elections. I think it'd be interesting to compare the cost of elections in the US and Mexico, for instance, or to compare, electoral costs with electoral costs. But perhaps at some other moment, you can provide us with that information, because that is a central part of the argument of the government, and it seems to me that we need to have that data very much at hand and clear, and also how to explain it, because it is large, that the cost is large if we compare it with other countries. But it's important, it seems to me, that we realize and provide arguments as to why that is the case. It's not that people are earning huge amounts of money or that there's huge inefficiencies necessarily. If I understand it correctly, part of the inefficiencies are inbuilt and are by design, precisely having to do with the fact that the main issue that the institutional design of INE and the whole system had to deal with was lack of trust in the electoral process. And so you had to have checks and balances in INE itself, which make it a relatively costly institution. But that has to do with history. But anyway, you are the experts. Simply, I think we need to address the issue of cost in order to deal effectively with one of the central arguments that Andrés Manuel López Obrador is making in relation to the need to change this electoral system. Second question for Lorenzo Córdoba. Are electoral institutions and processes in Mexico effectively fair? Is President López Obrador and his supporters completely wrong? Are there areas where fairness could be improved? How much is fairness an issue in terms of our current electoral institutional setup?
Well, let me start with a couple of words on the cost in elections. I mean, all the disqualification that López Obrador has and the harassment against the INE that has established in the last 4 or 5 years are based in 3 main issues. The costs, the unfairness of INE's decision, according to his point of view, of course, and third, a huge bureaucracy, which obviously affect the costs, but it's a problem itself.
And the
unnecessary
salary
and the salaries also, but yes, this golden bureaucracy and so on, so called. I mean, talking about the costs, if you make a comparison, despite what already, and I assume what Ciro has already said, if you make a comparison, a proportional comparison between electoral systems, for such as example the Brazilian one and the Panama's one, obviously there are different sizes, countries. I mean, but if you compare it in a proportional way, Panama's electoral system is higher, cost is higher than Mexican, and as well as the Brazilian one, for instance. The second issue, and I go to the issue of the by the way, the costs. Yeah, but the reform will increase inevitably the cost, and the López Obrador never assumed that many of his demands when he was an opposition leader were traduced in reforms which increases the cost of operational cost of INE. For instance, in 2006 election, he claimed that part of the fraud were the undue acquisition of propaganda in radio and TV. And therefore, for his claims, there was reinvented the communicational system, which increases the cost of the operational cost of INE in an exponential way. Is it free? Is not a fair authority? Well, I think it's a part of you know, the López Obrador and Morena's democratic disloyalty, which is produced in the fact that every time they win an election, they don't argue there was an undemocratic electoral process, and every time they lose an election, they claim a fraud. And it's very, I mean, you can document this allegation, these accusations in the last 5 years, in the period in which Morena was a ruling party. I think there is an objective data to confute the allegation or the accusation that INE is an unfair or has been an unfair institution. The fact is that since INE was redesigned in 2014 reform, by the way, Morena gets its registration as a political party in 2014. I mean, one of the first actuations as a president of INE was to give them the registration as a political party. All the winnings that Morena has earned in the last 10 years were in elections organized by INE. And in this period, the alternance rate in Mexico's election, both federal, local, and municipal elections, reaches 62%. So the probability in Mexico in the last 10 years that the ruling party wins the next electoral round is just 1 among 3. all the data will change with the results of the last election, this year's election. But my point is the main beneficiary of this high alternance rate is precisely Morena. So it's a contradictory discourse, the one who has been established and the one who aim, as Blanca said, this reform. By the way, what we saw in the last year, after the last renewal talking about selection committees, do you remember the last panel? The selection committees for the judges, yeah. Well, we have an example of what in electoral issues of what is a selection committee. In 2014, and 13, last year, but not 13, 2023. They set by the Constitution established it a selection committee which was integrated by 7 people. 5 of them were prominent politicians from Morena. One of them wrote the moral constitution. Another one was the legal representative of Morena in a state electoral body. I mean, that's what happens. Obviously, the claims against INE in this election went down in comparison of the accusations that happens in the past years, and I think that's in many ways because this INE was very very low strength against, the constitutional violations that we saw in an ineditus way in these elections. So the accusation of fairness, it depends on the electoral results, and obviously shows that those are unfair and false allegations.
Thank you, Lorenzo, very much. Apparently, the government does not have a whole lot of evidence about the INES and the systems behavior leading to unfairness. It's just been a repetition of this fact that has led a great number of people to believe that is the case. Luis Carlos, last question. Are there any major problems in Mexico's current electoral system and electoral life more generally that are not really identified or addressed by this initiative?
Yes.
This reform initiative.
Well, let me tell you, I am very concerned about many of the proposals by López Obrador, but since we are here in Washington at the Wilson Center talking about Mexican democracy, I think we need to focus more on why should the American public care about our democracy? Because to be honest, the problems here are different. You have your problems to be aware of Mexico's developments. Very few care about that now. And so thinking about the Mexican democracy, I would say that probably the fact that may affect the U.S. bilateral relationship in the long run is the inability and the lack of interest in Mexico to deal with the interference of organized crime in elections. And this problem eventually will create a narco state. And if you have that south to the border, then you have a problem here in the US. And I think this is the issue that should be the most relevant in terms of the international attention to the Mexican democracy. I have said that even more relevant and more dangerous than the judicial reform, which is very dangerous to the Mexican democratic state, is the lack of attention to the interference of organized crime. Because this problem creates is an issue for the survival of the Mexican state. And the judiciary is, of course, a problem of concentration of power and lack of protection, but not of the survival of the state. And I think this is the most relevant thing. López Obrador doesn't pay attention to that. The political parties, except for a few people within the PRI, have talked about that. Nobody talks about that. This is like the elephant in the kitchen or in the living room. And I don't see any reason to believe that is. There are many ways to deal with that. And I would say that the second problem is that if we don't promote competitive elections in Mexico, if we don't guarantee that in the future a different majority may win elections, which is the basic definition of democracy, then we are in a deep trouble in Mexico and in the region, because you have to deal with a partner that if it ceases to be a democracy, then the problem of concentration of power and all the deterioration that comes along with that will be there. And you know what happens with that. There are many examples in Latin America and the world, and so that is why I think the American public should pay more attention to the electoral democracy in Mexico.
Thank you, Luis Carlos. Unfortunately, we don't have time now for closing remarks. If we want to have a few questions, is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so shall we? I think we have time like for one or two questions. Anybody? Yeah, please, over there.
Thank you. Do you have any expectation about what will be the cost of these judiciary new elections for INE?
Well, at least the same cost of a federal election, which means around 500, almost $600 million dollars. But the judicial election, a federal election gets on the geographical basis of the electoral districts. There are only 300 electoral districts. If you want to improve an election of judges, you have to redraw the geographic electoral scenario. And the number of jurisdictions in which judges will be elected very probably will arise with another bureaucratic problem. INE has no local bodies in order to run elections for those new electoral jurisdictions. I mean, INE was thought for one thing, and just say, well, INE will run elections for electing judges and electing the electoral councillors and whoever you want. I mean, suppose redefining all the INE's organization. Not to mention the fact that part of the costs should be defined not by the law, but because the judiciary reform, they didn't say this in the last panel, allows INE, authorize INE to determine all the rules for the electoral process of judges. And that's part of the main key bones in order to build trust in our history. INE applies the rules, do not make the rules, because if he does that, we'll have a problem.
Critical. That is absolutely critical. At the same time, it does open the door, right?
Yeah, sure.
It does open the door for adjustments. Anyway, there was another person before. I think here, yeah, you.
Thank you.
I think that's the last one we're going to have to take. Sorry, but we'll have a little break, so you can talk with the panelists in the break.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask, in what ways could this reform affect Mexico's relationship with international organizations that promote both judicial independence and human rights?
Well,
Dolia, ¿no? Sí, Dolia.
Luis Carlos, and the question is for anyone that wants to answer. You mentioned the influence of organized crime in elections. Here, last week, the Department of Justice just announced a major interference into the elections in the United States of the Russians through the media they controlled, through fake news, through social media, etc. So my question is, have you or any of you that are so involved in the elections in Mexico noticed any kind of interference from the same country, in this case Russia, or perhaps also Iran or Cuba, or I don't know, any of the enemies of the Western world, and concretely the United States and obviously Mexico?
I don't have any information on that, just about the organized crime I was talking about, but not on that.
Well, thank you so much. If I may just...
We don't have time to ask.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I think Mexico is going ahead for the agenda of human rights and democracy in the world. When Mexico built the trust electoral system, get close with all the world electoral bodies, and it's a reference of free and fair elections. And we are losing this reputation. And the worst thing is we must think in the basis of democracy and fair election. It was a precious invention of humanity to avoid the political violence. Mexico has nowadays a huge wave of violence by the gangs, by the narcotic business, but we, in the last 3 decades, have not had a problem of political violence. And if we close the doors to the participation to the minorities, if we close the door to possibility to change the local governments, the mayors, the governors, or the presidency, there is a strong society, a real plurality society with different interests, with different points of view. If we close the formal and legal square to compete for the power, there will be another ways, very dangerous ways, and it will have consequences in the economic stability in all the things. So try to save the Mexican democracy is try to save also the stability in the United States.
Yeah, just a piece of information that I'm sure all of you know, but just to keep it in mind, that number. 44% of the Mexican people that went out to vote on June 2nd did not vote for Morena or the parties that were allied to Morena.
Yeah.
It's not a minor fraction of the population, right? 44%. And I think that's part of the reason why it's important, if not for democratic reasons, if somebody might not be too interested in democracy, perhaps governance, government order might be an issue. And more generally, I think there's a whole agenda of both action and research, if I may say so, coming out of these panels, that it would be, I think, extremely interesting to pursue, to kind of put in black and white and pursue. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege and honor to moderate this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blanca.
Trian, are you there? Trian, are you there?
Very interesting. No, it's no, clearly I'm not. You know,
That would be amazing. Yes, thank you. ¿Qué tal te toca?
Muy bien. La clave es que no nos pasemos del tiempo.
Exacto. Exacto, exacto. Sí, yo aquí lo tengo bien controlado y listo. Ok. Todavía no tenemos fecha para esta, ¿verdad?
No, que eso es muy importante.
Sí, pensaba mencionarlo, nada más quería double check si tienes otra información, pero no tenemos fecha ni de discusión ni nada.
Nada.
Yeah. Let's do it. Let's start now. Yeah, we can close the door, and then you give me the sign when we start. Amazing. No, no, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. You're good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Calderon. I'm a program associate at the Mexico Institute. Welcome to our third and last panel of our Constitutional Reforms Conference, where we'll discuss the autonomous agencies reforms, as well as other amendments that could have economic repercussions for both Mexico and the United States. So, as most of you know, the reform to eliminate some of Mexico's autonomous agencies was proposed by President López Obrador in February of this year. Now, there is still no specific date for discussing the reform in Congress. However, it is one of the main reform proposals that the incoming administration in Mexico intends to pursue. So we can expect that it will be discussed in the upcoming months. I will not delve into explaining the nature, functions, and relevance of an autonomous agency in Mexico, since our amazing panelist, Carlos, will address such topics during our conversation. However, I will briefly mention the reform's main proposals as it is drafted now. It is worth mentioning that modifications could be done to the initial proposal once the discussion starts in Congress. So this brief summary will deliver the main intended changes to the reform as it is currently drafted. The reform intends to transfer the capacities of certain autonomous agencies, not all of them, to be incorporated into the executive branch, in other words, under the presidency, and in some cases to the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, INEGI, and the National Electoral Institute, INE. So the main changes and transfers that the reform proposes are as follows. The Federal Economic Competition Commission, COFECE, which promotes, protects, and guarantees competition in all markets, except those in the broadcasting and telecommunications sector, would be transferred to the Ministry of Economy. The National Institute of Transparency, Access to Information, and Protection of Personal Data, INAI, which oversees enforcing transparency and data protection, would be transferred to the Secretary of Public Function, the National Electoral Institute, and the Federal Center for Conciliation and Labor Registration, depending on the subject matter. The Energy Regulator Commission and the National Hydrocarbons Commission, in charge of the economic and technical regulations in terms of energy and hydrocarbons, would be transferred to the Ministry of Energy. The Federal Telecommunications Institute, EFT, which regulates access to the telecommunications sector, would be transferred to the Ministry of Infrastructure, Communications, and Transportation. And finally, the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, CONEVAL, which develops independent studies to measure social development and poverty, would be transferred to the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, INEGI. Finally, it is important to briefly mention that the main arguments to justify the elimination of said autonomous agencies is that they are expensive and inefficient, that they serve to protect oligarchic interests, and that they lack popular support. Let's mention that all these reasons can be and should be widely debated and analyzed. So with this brief introduction, I will introduce our wonderful panelists, which bring unique perspectives, experience, since two of them have previously directed an autonomous agency. And our other two panelists bring years of experience in analyzing public policy issues. With this set of panelists, the aim is to provide a technical as well as a general overview of the issues at hand. So we have Carlos Ramirez, who is partner and co-director of Integralia Consultores, Alejandra Palacios, a former chair of Mexico's antitrust agency, COFECE, Gonzalo Hernández Licona, a former executive secretary of the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Policy, Coneval, and finally, Viridiana Rios, author, scholar, and public policy advisor. And with that, I give the floor to you, Carlos. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Wilson Center for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you here and share with my colleagues basically a very significant topic. We've, in the past weeks, put all the attention in Mexico to what happened basically with a judicial reform. But really, no one was looking at, or so far no one was looking at what was going to happen with another bill. Remember, as Maria explained, February 5th, President López Obrador presented 18 constitutional reforms. Some of them really were not looked at seriously, and I think one of the most consequential reforms that remain in place or will be discussed eventually, not yet, but eventually, is the disappearance of the autonomous institution. My colleagues here will speak a little bit about their own experience and view. I'm going to devote 3.5 minutes, to explain a little bit on where these institutions came from, because it is very important to understand that in order to try to gauge what would be the consequences of disappearing these institutions in Mexico. So basically, if you situate in Mexico in the 1970s, 80s, there was an hegemonic party in control of the judiciary, of the legislative, of the executive. No counterbalances, no checks and balances to the discretionary power of the president. And an economy that basically was decided in good part by the decisions of the president. Every single important decision from an economic perspective in the country was decided by one man. So Mexico started a slow-moving process of opening its economy in the beginning, let's say late 70s, 80s, as a result of a devastating financial crisis, by the way, and as well as its transition to democracy, basically at the same time at the end of the 80s and mid-90s. So in good part, these institutions were born as a result of Mexico's opening to, let's say, a free market economy in the first place, and also a competitive democracy in the second place. I would say and mention, and obviously give ground to my colleagues here, three main reasons that these institutions were created in the first time, in the first place. The first reason is an economic reason. Mexico, although in the 90s, 70s, 60s had a relatively high level of economic growth, Mexico has been struggling for many decades, for all, basically many years with a relatively low economic growth rate, right? So one of the reasons why these institutions started being part of the scenery in the Mexican economy landscape was a result of a necessity to create a common ground, a level playing field for all players to participate in the economy, in which the monopolies, the public monopolies of the country and the private monopolies of the country had a very, very strong position and an advantageous position. So one of the reasons, and obviously Hannah, who was the lead person in COFECE, can speak about its history, but it was the first institution to be created because, as a part of a revolution that went on in Mexico to opening its democracy and to creating a better level of participation and competition in the country. That was the first reason. The second reason has to do with an international reason. Mexico signed NAFTA in 1993. And as a result, several rules were created in NAFTA that brought into place the need of Mexico to institutionalizing its economy and obviously its politics as well, its democracy, but mainly its economy. So Mexico compromised with that view, with that idea of forming part of the North American region, and that led slowly to the creation of these institutions, but that, by the way, were not created exactly at the same time. It was a slow-moving process, but clearly in the same direction. And finally, and I will close here my initial remarks, there was a political economy reason that I think it's very important to understand at this moment of Mexican's political and economic life. And it has to do with a democracy that slowly started transitioning to a democracy, and in which the president that had an enormous discretionary power to decide on anything in the economic and political realm had to start giving, let's say, part of his power to single institutions in a way to create checks and balances and guarantee all players that the rules were going to be followed by technical rules, not political decisions. So it was a political economy decision because the president had to leave part of his power and basically giving it to this institution as a way to invite investors to participate in Mexican economy and to guarantee that Mexico was transitioning to a real democracy and to a real free market economy. So I would say that's the history of where these institutions came. Now, finally, we're discussing about bringing them back to where they were in the 1970s. So this in itself would mean that Mexico would go back 50 years back to where it was and how its economy evolved and developed at that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Very deep and meaningful introduction. Alejandra, over to you. Thank you. Oh, we're not able to hear you, Alejandra. So I'm gonna.
Sorry. There
we go. Okay.
Sorry. So I was saying thank you very much for this invitation. So as you've mentioned, there is currently under consideration a reform to eliminate regulatory bodies in competition, energy, telecom, transparency, data privacy, and the agency that evaluates social policy. And as you said, the idea is to return these regulatory powers to the executive branch. As Carlos mentioned very well, it's since the 1990s that certain political agreements gradually led to the creation of these agencies. As Carlos mentioned, they were established by several motivations, but regardless of concrete motivations for each of these agencies, because each of these agencies has a concrete motivation, they intentionally reduced the regulatory powers originally assigned to the executive. To make this point clear, I'd like to go back to an anecdote in 2015. So following the constitutional reforms that opened up energy markets in Mexico and a whole package of structural reforms, they were called like that at that time, the Mexican president invited the world's largest investment funds to a meeting. And the purpose of the meeting was to explain those structural reforms and highlight new investment opportunities in Mexico, particularly in the energy sector. In attendance were several government ministries, including the energy and the treasury ministries at that time. Also present were the economic regulators responsible for implementing those reforms, such as the Energy Regulatory Commissioner, Chair Commissioner, and myself. At that moment, I was head of the antitrust agency. So, interesting, in that meeting, it was basically the regulators who did most of the talking. And for me, it was very clear that the message of the president at that time, the message he was trying to convey, was that Mexico was strengthening its regulatory institutions to build confidence and certainty to bring long-term investments. So 10 years later, what has happened under this current administration is that it has become evident that these regulatory bodies have acted as a counterbalance to the decisions that popularly elected officials want to make. So the common theme across this package, the package we're talking about right now, is the return of discretionary powers on regulatory matters to the executive. And that includes deciding, how companies in this markets, the future of companies in this market. And this basically based on the belief that the popular will should not be constrained by technicalities. So when we discuss which regulatory model is best, I like to answer it in terms of what is best for our country. I believe that we all agree that the priority is to have a growing economy that improves the living standards of those in most need. So with that goal in mind, I firmly believe that maintaining the current regulatory model is the way to go. So let me go in concrete to COFECE and why I believe this model should hold. Because if COFECE were to be absorbed by the executive branch, the result could be a system dangerously, highly susceptible to both corporate favoritism and to corporate extortion. Currently, COFECE's institutional design ensures that no individual between the Commission can define the agenda. No one unilaterally can interfere in procedures or determine sanctions, and no one unilaterally can manipulate enforcement procedures to serve state interest. And I mean, we have an example of the contrary, which has already happened in the energy sector, because in the CRE, they lost their technical autonomy right at the beginning of this government. And we've known that procedures in CRE have been used to stifle competition in favor of the Mexican state-owned electricity utility, which is CFE. So in the energy sector, what we've seen is that political motivations is what determine which companies operate today in the energy sector. And for the US folks over there, it's true, some US firms have secured their operations in Mexico, but basically because they've had the ear of the president, and this with a US ambassador personally advocating for them. But not all firms have or will have this level of access in the future. Additionally, there's a threat in terms of fines, and that these could be used for political repression. And this is concerning for COFECE particularly because COFECE is the administrative agency with the largest sanctions in the whole Mexican legal framework. And these sanctions could be up to 10% of a company's annual revenue. Additionally, if COFECE's functions were to be transferred to the central government, merger control could be subject to political influence, favoring government-friendly companies and national champions. So it's important to bear in mind that COFECE oversees all major mergers and acquisitions in Mexico, and in 2023, nearly 52% of all the mergers reviewed by COFECE were related to foreign entities looking to establish operations in Mexico. Some may argue that transferring COFECE's functions to the Ministry of Economy would not necessarily eliminate its independence. After all, and this is true, several competition agencies worldwide do operate within ministries and remain highly respected as such. For example, the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And this same argument could be applied to the telecom and the energy regulators. But there is a concern here, and we must not forget that we don't know yet how these functions will be structured within the possible respective ministries. If the reform moves forward, then what will happen is that we'll have secondary laws that will restructure or will tell us how these functions will be absorbed by the ministries. And there should be a very careful design to preserve specialization and independence. But what we do know, one, is that Morena has the majority in Congress, so Morena can decide those secondary laws as it likes. And Morena hasn't been open to discussing with stakeholders the future of how these laws could look forward. And from what we saw yesterday, the space for this discussion is minimal, so I'm not optimistic in that sense. And then also what we know is that there is going to be necessarily more inference by the federal branch, by the president himself. I mean, this is essentially the ideas of these reforms. I'll keep it here, and then maybe I could go more into the impact of this on the USMCA. Just to say that many things are still in the air. There's the impact might be huge, although it's potential, because as I said, we will still need, after this reform, to know how the secondary bylaws come about. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Gonzalo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you for the Wilson Center for the invitation. Let me add a little bit of the history that Carlos mentioned, but focusing on accountability and transparency. And it is true that 35 years ago or so, I mean, the president used to be, in practice, the boss of the ruling party, the boss of those in Congress, the boss of most governors, sometimes the boss of the media, and therefore none of them were keen in making the president accountable. I mean, within the government, there were no institutional arrangement or structures for transparency and accountability. There was no civil service either. Therefore, the new president usually removed everyone from the previous governments. But fortunately, the very slow building of democracy changed these, and through political agreements between diverse political parties, by the way, some of them at that time members of the ruling party Morena today, that we were able to have various independent and autonomous institutions to address transparency and accountability. So we mentioned the Institute to Access for Information, the Institute to Evaluation of Education, the Institute of Measuring Poverty and Evaluation of Public Policy. So we were not able to generate a proper and technically trained civil service, but the creation of these independent institutions was a political answer at that time to the lack of accountability and transparency at that moment. And democracy needs accountability and transparency and certainty about the state of public policy in Mexico. And one very important element for those institutions is the governance of them. I mean, the main decision-making bodies of these institutions, the board, let's say, they include diverse individuals, not appointed by the president. So there's not only one person making decisions on those institutions. And this is key for the real independence of these institutions. I can give you an example. I mean, when I was the executive secretary of Coneval, measuring poverty and doing evaluation, I had many suggestions from government officials to change the way we measure poverty to make it nicer, right? And in all these cases, I used to answer, okay, that may be a good idea. Why don't you take that proposal to the council with 6 independent academics, and let's see what they say. And in all those occasions, these people in government refused to go there, and therefore we were truly independent, not because of the executive director, but because of the board of academics on that institution. So with the creation of these institutions, we were able to say properly when poverty went up, when programs were not working, when government officials must give information to citizens. So that was our answer to the problem we had on accountability and transparency. Today, however, I believe that we're getting the clock backwards 35 years with the reform proposed by the president. As it happened 35 years ago, today we have a president who is the actual boss, not only of government, but also of Congress, of most governors, of some elements of the media. We may soon will not have these institutions promoting accountability. But we have instead a president who lies every morning at 250 miles per hour. So he lies about the results of public policy. He lies about almost everything. He lies to the American government. So the reform proposed by him is not about improving the institutional arrangements to make the government more accountable and more transparent. The main idea is to get rid of these institutions the way they are now, with a huge uncertainty about their final governance. As Alejandra was saying, we don't know the final arrangement of those institutions in their final houses. For instance, the Ministry of Education will oversee the evaluation of education programs and strategies, and the education minister will be appointed by the president. So let's say these institutions that we created are not working properly to support accountability. Well, we can improve them. Furthermore, we can think of a different institutional arrangement even without some of these institutions. For instance, Chile doesn't need an independent entity for the good evaluations that they make. We may think of a different arrangement, perhaps within the government, perhaps with civil servants. However, this reform is not about that, unfortunately. This reform is about giving more power to the president, who doesn't like to be accountable and who will not leave the political theater for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Viri, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. So I'd like to use my time to do a couple things. The first one is to briefly expose my concerns about the proposed reforms. And the second one is talking more broadly about Mexico's institutional future. So let me start with the first point, right, by saying that I do not like the proposed reform. And I don't like it for two reasons. The first one is because I believe that changes of this nature, which are broad institutional changes, should be negotiated rather than approved by a single coalition. And for what we are observing, it seems that this is not going to be a negotiated process. The second one, and it's probably much more important than the first one, is that I'm not a huge fan, and I think nobody should be, of changing institutions that more or less are working, right? And I think that Mexico's autonomous institutions have much room for improvement. However, they do work better than other previous versions of those institutions, and they do work better than other current institutions in Mexico. So I think that all the energy of policymakers and the government and the discussion should be into reforming how these institutions work to make them better and into improving the institutions that are really not working. Okay, so we're not on that, I would say, ideal scenario. So let me now move into my second point, which is about the future institutional arrangement, right? So having said all these, I'd like to now focus on what I think is kind of like the elephant in the room in terms of the public discussion about autonomous institutions in Mexico. And in my opinion, that elephant is the fact that for what I can see, hear, and observed, it seems like for a lot of Mexican liberals, for a lot of us, for many Mexican liberals, there is an unwillingness, I would say, to accept the fact that other institutional arrangements different from the autonomous institutions that we designed, that we created, and that we validated over the last 2 decades may exist and be successful in Mexico. And I think this is a mistake. At points, I feel that this discussion feels more like equating maintaining the current institutional arrangement as maintaining liberal democracy. And I don't think that should be, discussed in that way. I understand where this mistake is coming from. I think that it comes from a very human fact, which is the very human fact that we, the Mexican liberals, people speaking in this conference, are the main constructors of these institutions. And we believe in these institutions, and we believe in what we did, and we believe we did the right thing, right? And that's fair, and that's fine. However, to be honest, we have to accept that there may be many institutional arrangements that could exist in Mexico and that exist in other formal constituted democracies that are not necessarily constitutional autonomy. And that those countries that are democracies are not necessarily the same as returning 70 years in time. So it's also very important to notice that the reform is not necessarily proposing to eliminate the regulators. Actually, it's not proposing to do that. Neither it is proposing to change the regulation. What this reform is doing is making the regulator dependent on the executive. And again, I'm not in favor of that. I think the institutional arrangement that we have is fine, but I also think that we need to accept that many regulators in the world, in constituted democracies, are dependent of the executive or of the legislative branch and are autonomous institutions that work. Let me give you a couple examples. One, in antitrust commissions, if we think about COFECE, COFECE is the most independent antitrust competition authority in the world, according to the data, right? Most antitrust commissions are dependent either on the executive or on the legislative. And in terms of performance, if we observe these institutions, COFECE is not the best authority in the world. COFECE is worse than many other antitrust institutions that do not have autonomy. And we could compare that, for example, with the European and the British institutions or with the Japanese competition authority. All of them are evaluated better than Mexico's COFECE and yet are not autonomous. Second example, in terms of telecommunications. And I think we were already kind of like discussing a little bit of this, but like Chile, for example, does not have an independent body in charge of regulating telecommunications. And in Chile, the agency in charge of this is under under the charge of the Undersecretary of Telecommunications, right? And that is directly dependent on the Ministry of Transport and Telecommunications. So I'm saying all these because I feel that we need to bring the discussion into a different territory. And that territory where I would like, and I think it would be much better for Mexico and for the relationship of two countries to have, that territory will be to discuss whether autonomy is the desirable and the most defining institutional feature that allows these institutions to be effective. And if it is not, which seems to be the case because of the many examples that we have of institutions that are non-autonomous and are better than the Mexican institutions, then really think about what are those institutional features that are really making these institutions work. And I feel that doing this is very important because of something that is very real, which is I think Morena will approve the reforms. And I think it is better to approach these changes in a way that allow us to properly evaluate what are those things that we are going to demand from Morena and from the government as to be the most important institutional arrangements, the kind of like the non-negotiables of the future institutional arrangement of Mexico. I think we need to be very strategic on this, and I think we need to help the Mexican government design the new institutional arrangement that they want, because if we don't help them, they are just going to do it without us. And I think that would be by far a much worse outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Viri. Alejandra, I know that you have your hand raised, so I'll give you the word. Thank you. Oh, you're muted, Alejandra.
Sorry, I'm not going to mute my microphone anymore in this conference. So I agree with Viri in general. Of course, I mean, sort of what she said is what I said in terms of that some may argue that COFECE's functions in the Ministry of Economy could not necessarily eliminate its independence. I also said several competition agencies worldwide operate within ministries and are highly regarded, as Viri says, more than the Mexican Antitrust Agency. So, I mean, I agree with that in general, but there's certain things that I think it's important to take into account. One is, very important is, where does this reform come from? Does it come from the necessity to make these agencies work better? So then the question there would be, do they need autonomy or not? Should they be independent or not? Can they be independent within the ministries or not? So those are very relevant questions if you really want to fix these agencies and make them better. The thing here is, at least in my view, is that these reforms all come from the desire of President López Obrador to have the discretionary power to take certain decisions. So I think that's important to think of. And then the other question is, Mexico has certain commitments under the USMCA, and it's important to consider that what we read in these reforms does not necessarily imply that Mexico will not comply with these commitments, but it could. It could. Why? Because Chapter 21 of the USMCA does not talk about a specific competition agency, but it does prescribe that whatever arrangement you have, this one needs to, it requires it to be fair, equitable. You need to have a due process. So let's see how the new arrangement comes about. In terms of competitive neutrality, Chapter 22 emphasizes competitive neutrality, particularly concerning to state-owned enterprises. So on the one hand, if COFECE loses independence, it might be less stringent in the energy sector. Also, if the Ministry of Energy becomes responsible for energy policy, it's also responsible for regulatory policy, and it also has huge control over Pemex and CFE and their business decisions. Of course, there is a risk of undermining competitive neutrality. And then in the telecom sector, Chapter 18 talks about the necessity of having an independent agency and not have it subordinate to a service provider. But the truth is that the Mexican government right now has or is involved in two telecom companies, Altlan and CFE Telecom. So the question remains, can you have a regulator within the executive branch who also manages service providers? So, and as I said, the risk of not complying with the USMCA is potential because we don't know the final outcome, because the constitutional reforms, if passed, eventually they will need to unfold in secondary laws. But as Viri said, from our experience in the past 15 days, it's apparent that Morena has no willingness to engage with stakeholders to open these discussions. So that is really what worries me. So I agree, this is not black or white, but how things have evolved in the past 6 months, especially in the past 2 weeks, more specifically yesterday, I am worrisome. I am worrisome that we won't comply with the USMCA, and I'm worrisome that instead of making these agencies work better, the only thing we will have is a powerful president having discretionary powers to decide how markets work.
Thank you, Alejandra. And I mean, I completely agree. Given the judicial reform that they just voted upon yesterday and the electoral reform that we mentioned on our panel today, it seems that the discussion of how is it that we want to design these institutions, I am not sure that the political, like Morena, would be open to receiving such, feedback exactly on the reform. So, Carlos, following Alejandra's comment on USMCA, I know that you've been also studying a lot of those impacts. How do you see companies in Mexico moving forward? And is there a threat to unbiased regulations in Mexico? How do you see that?
So let me just answer with an anecdote, personal anecdote that could help go specifically into the USMCA potential impact and how will companies feel if this reform is approved. So I was a regulator as well in Mexico, but the difference with my colleagues, Hanna and Gonzalo, was that my institution, CONSAR, the pension regulator in Mexico, was not independent. We are part of the Ministry of Finance, and my boss at that time was the Minister of Finance and the President. So easily one could look at the institutional differences, that one institution that doesn't have a direct boss in a ministry and in a presidency, how it functions and how an independent autonomous institution works. So every single decision I had to take during 6 years regarding the pension system, no single decision was made by myself or my board. All decisions were in some way or another filtered, looked at, or singled by the president and by the minister. So, and that's the way it works. And it works like that everywhere in the world. Let's be clear about this. I mean, usually financial regulators are not entirely independent almost anywhere in the world. But I bring that example because it is clear that if these institutions end up being part of the executive, the new regulator of the Competition Commission, the new person in charge of measuring poverty, probably the Coneval is a bit different, and Gonzalo can probably explain that, because that will move into INEGI, right, which is an autonomous institution. But the energy regulators, the telecom regulators, who will they have to respond? Who will the new regulator will have to respond to? Obviously, they will have a boss. They will have someone who they have to answer to. So easily, easily, despite the fact that there's other institutional arrangements in other parts of the world, their political economy history is much different. Chile has a history of very strong institutions. So they probably don't need an autonomous institution regulating competition or telecom, because that is how they evolved during the past 50, 60 years. Mexico didn't take that institutional path. Mexico took a different institutional path because it was part of our own history that led us here. Now, answering your question, my sense is that the USMCA revision of 2026, the so-called Sunset Clause review, was going to be complex by itself, okay? Because there are several aspects in which Mexico has definitely not complied. And the US has been highly, highly tolerant with Mexico in terms of what has happened in the energy sector, in the ag sector, and more recently in other issues that have come out regarding China and Iran and other issues. So it was going to be already a very contentious revision. But now add to that this enormous, gigantic judicial reform transformation that we will go through the next years, that no one really knows how will end up, but we can suspect how will end up in terms of politicization, and at the same time going through the disappearance of autonomous institutions. Definitely, it will make us, I'm talking as a Mexican, it will make Mexico much more vulnerable. It will make Mexico go into the negotiation seat with a very weak position of really convincing the US and Canada that really nothing happened in Mexico with these enormous, gigantic reforms. And no one is going to believe Mexico, because clearly we would be in the transition process, and this is going to take years before we end up knowing what will come after this enormous institutional destruction. So my sense, Maria, is that we will go into a very contentious discussion. And finally, final word, who wins in the US? Because clearly a Kamala government or a Trump government would be much different, and the negotiation arrangement and the table would be very different with one president and the other. I don't want to talk about how I see that, but my sense is that Mexico, either president, it's going to be a highly contentious discussion starting next year and certainly in 2026. And we are complicated. Mexico is complicated. Its own life by itself, putting in this weakened position because of this reform that fortunately hasn't been touched upon, but certainly also it is likely to be discussed soon.
So a lot to stay in tuned with, right? Thank you, Carlos, for that answer. So taking it back, the conversation to Mexico, Gonzalo, I would like to ask you, how is it that you envision, of course, we know that the reform could potentially change, it's just a proposal, but in terms of accountability and transparency in Mexico, accountability, how would citizens request information from the government, companies, if maybe the own executive would be the one handling this information? How do you see that environment in Mexico?
I've been patiently raising my hand, but thank you very much for giving the floor.
Sorry, I didn't see you.
I mean, related to your question and what we've been discussing, and Alejandra and Viri said, I mean, my point is, each country, according to their history, its history, its institutions, its political agreements, they we got to agreements specifically according to that specific country. So Chile is a very good example of a country that for many decades, even with the military coup, they do have reliable institutions. They don't need, as I said before, an autonomous evaluation unit as we did in Mexico, as we do in Mexico, because what they do in the case of Chile is that within the Ministry of Hacienda in Finance Ministry, they did start their evaluation unit, and it's a reliable evaluation unit. Still now, even that it depends on eventually on the president, because that's the Chile arrangement. In the Mexican case, according to our history and according to over 70 years of a PRI and all that, we made arrangements for these institutions to be the ones responding to the needs in terms of accountability, in terms of measurement, in terms of transparency. These were our agreements, and I insist, including people who now work either in the government or are in Morena. So let me give you some names: Pablo Gómez, Clara Brugada, Tatiana Cloutier, Ricardo Monreal, César Cravioto, María Lucy Micher, Manuel Velasco, Horacio Duarte, Alfonso Ramírez Cuellar, Dolores Padierna, Lázaro Cárdenas Batel. They signed very happily the decree of the creation of Coneval in 2004. And now they just got forgot about it because their incentives changed. Now they are on the other side of the table. Now they are in power. When they were not in power, they were keen to make the president accountable. They were keen to make the president transparent. Now they are on the other side with a very strong president. So I mean, this reform, I believe, Bidi, it is not about how can we improve accountability and transparency. It's not about that. It's about reducing the power of these institutions and getting back to the president. So if you tell me we will be, I mean, a president such as Gabriel Boric or Felipe González or Tony Blair will be addressing these reforms in the near future, we may have a hope. But we will be dealing with Andrés Manuel López Obrador for the next 6 years, I believe. So I don't think that there is a space for others to improve. I mean, of course, we need to carry on working and trying to impact the reforms. But as we saw yesterday, the hope is not there. So what I believe is, it is true that countries such as Chile, Canada, and of course developing countries, they had different arrangements, and they don't need autonomous institutions because it's too much for them. They cannot do without them. We were not lucky enough so far, and the reform is not about improving them. So my worry is we may go back 35 years, 40 years in terms of transparency and accountability. And if you add, in terms of accountability and transparency, that the military is going to take over more elements, and usually they are not accountable. Militaries, they don't like accountability, and they close their information. So we will be in the worst position as the one we had 35 years ago, with the military just closing their information because it's a state secret. Trying to find information about the Tren Maya is top secret. So that's our Mexico today. Therefore, I don't think we will be improving. We will be improving with this reform in the near future.
Viri, do you want to answer, Gonzalo? Or should I pose another question?
More than answering Gonzalo, I think I would like to make a second and more strategic statement, which is all institutions have a boss, right? That's the nature of institutions. And it is an ideological position, and we need to understand it like that, to argue that it is much, much better to have an independent professionals taking decisions than to have the state taking decisions. I am not sure what's best. But I do think that if, as academics and as experts, we observed comparatively the institutional arrangements of many countries, the answer to this is very unclear. It's not clear cut. It's not clear cut that autonomy is the main and most important institutional feature that makes regulators succeed. And I actually believe that it is, and again, let me just repeat, it is only strategic to try to understand exactly what it is that makes regulators effective in order to demand that those specific institutional features remain as much as possible as part of the new institutional arrangement. Now, let me now talk about politics, because I think that's also something we haven't addressed so far, right? Morena is a party with a real strong and very organized base. That base is demanding reforms. That's a reality of the country we're living in. And another reality is that the opposition lost the election and Morena is going to approve reforms. So I think that under this specific scenario, which is we who designed these institutions lost, and we lost democratically. Under this scenario, I think the best move is to try to allow reform, allow Morena to perform the reform. I mean, there is nothing we can do to stop it, but allow Morena to do it, allowing Morena to responding to its base by performing this reform, and then helping Morena and helping policymakers reduce as much as possible, reduce to the minimum the impact of that reform. And I do think that is possible, because right now the reform is very broad, and we all have said this, but let me just emphasize it because this is critical for the international audience. Right now the reform is very broad, and the way in which this reform is going to be implemented hasn't been drafted. The implementation is going to be determined on the secondary laws. And this is a good thing, because Morena does not know those secondary laws. They haven't even designed them. They haven't created them. So we have a lot of opportunity there to influence. So the opportunity, in my opinion, but here I'm being very kind of like strategic on this, the opportunity is not clinging to the current institutional arrangement and arguing that Mexico is not, that AMLO is not Macron, or that if we were like Chile and all that. No. That's just like, you know, I don't think there is a lot to move into that direction in terms of the strategy. I think the strategy is trying to influence those secondary laws that are probably going to be determined not by López Obrador, but by Sheinbaum, in order for those secondary laws to be the best possible scenario. For example, I observe there is a very large spectrum, right? On the most catastrophic, worst scenario possible, we would have autonomous institutions disappearing and then becoming offices that don't have money and don't have staff and don't have capacity to operate, and they are under the umbrella of another federal institution. That's the worst case scenario, right? But on the best case scenario, we could imagine a relatively virtuous new institutional arrangement, such as the autonomous institution becoming decentralized organisms with some forms of technical autonomy that remain, for example, having a board to make some of the technical decisions. I think the political battle should be there, and I think the discussion should be there, and that would be, in my opinion, a profoundly much more fertile discussion.
Thank you, Viri. I will let the experts talk. So Alejandra, I know that you have your hand raised. Up to you.
Yes. I mean, again, I in general agree with what Viri is saying. So my experience, antitrust agency, what makes an antitrust agency effective? I mean, there's tons of literature written about it. Basically, it's four things. One, it's budget, that it has the budget to operate. Two, that it has the people, the technical specialized people, and that it has the possibility to hire and to retain them. Third, that it has enforcement powers. I mean, it has a well-put merger control, and that it has investigative tools and, you know, sanctions that are meaningful, etc. And then fourth, that it has the possibility to take independent decisions. So I agree many arrangements, different arrangements could take you to that. Now, that's like in general, but if we go back to the Mexican context again, what we saw 6 years ago when López Obrador came into government is that he reduced the salaries of public servants, high-level public servants, by half. So many people within COFECE filed their amparos, so they've kept their salaries at the level they had before President López Obrador came into force. I even received letters from the central government asking me to fire those people who had filed amparos, and I said I can't do that. I mean, that's illegal. You have a judiciary order telling you that your salary stays in place while they decide what happens there, so I can't fire these people. And 6 years later, what we see is that COFECE, as a regulatory agency, is still capable of a lot, and it has not lost its technical independence, in part because it has its public servants, specialized public servants. I don't know if, and it's a question, I don't know if when COFECE's functions pass into the Ministry of Economy, they will respect those salaries or not. I don't know if today those specialized competition public servants will survive in this new arrangement. That's a question I have. I agree with Viri. You need to let the people who are in government today know that, but there's that risk. Another risk in terms of budget. COFECE, as its arrangement today, it doesn't decide its budget, but it sends its budget proposal directly to Congress. If you're part of the executive branch, it's the ministry who decides what agencies within those ministries have that budget. So again, COFECE today has budgetary independence. When it loses its autonomy, it will immediately lose that independence. So will the new government respect its budget, or will it reduce it? I would think it would reduce it, because the reform today says that the idea of this reform, in part, is to save budgetary money. So, I mean, it would be very strange if they kept the same budget. But these are all questions. So, budget, people, enforcement powers, and independence. Let's see what happens going forward. And I am not being optimistic because, as I've said, it appears that there's little willingness to engage with stakeholders in open discussions on how these reforms will eventually unfold in secondary laws. I wish I could have these conversations. I want to help. I think having a strengthened regulatory economic policy is important for economic growth for the people in most need. But I don't see that space right now, and that is what has me a little bit being pessimistic, and again, I worry.
Thank you for those insights, Alejandra. I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit around. I mean, I know that we have a lot of unanswered questions on this reform, but we also need to talk about other economic implications that these reforms would imply for Mexico and the United States. So, Carlos, between the 18 constitutional reforms that President López Obrador presented this February, which other concerning points do you see in terms of trade, in terms of economic relations between Mexico and the United States?
Yes, and Gonzalo was raising his hand. I'll go quickly, Gonzalo, so you can first. There was 18 reforms, now there's 17. Electoral reform, as discussed previously, was put into ice. It will eventually come back, but right now it's into ice. Yesterday, we had the judicial reform approved. There are 16 left. If you look meticulously to each one of these 16 reforms, I would say, Maria, that there are at least four more reforms. I would say five probably, but let's keep it simple. Four reforms that are potentially damaging for the business environment overall, potentially damaging to the USMCA negotiations starting next year, and certainly not good for economic growth. We've discussed the autonomous institution reform, clearly for the reasons already stated. But then you have an energy reform, which no one is paying too much attention to it, that would, by the way, has a lot to do with this reform of autonomous institutions. Because what it's proposing is that CFE and Pemex become, in a nutshell, again, sort of the big monopoly players of the 70s and 80s. It would take them, their character of productive companies, and basically to become public, social public companies. And this means in itself that it will lead to a lot more power for this, both CFE and Pemex. So not only the regulators are going to disappear, then you're going to have the heavyweights becoming much more powerful. So this combination is disastrous in terms of inviting private investors to participate in this market. But there's two others. There's one that has to do with water concessions. There's a lot of companies in Mexico that depend on water concessions for reasons, normal reasons of their business line. And this bill would basically challenge the current model of concessions in water and would put at risk what the companies already are doing right now. So I think it would create a lot of uncertainty. Then there is a mining reform, which basically says that no more mining in open air will be allowed in Mexico. That reform, said by their own stakeholders, by the own industry, would kill investment for the next coming decades in Mexico in the mining industry, which, by the way, has been hurt very hard by a legislative reform approved in April of 2023. So this would be, let's say, a double whammy for the mining industry. And finally, we have a bill that has to do, all these social policy bills, the one that has to do with minimum wage, with pensions, those bills are probably less potentially damaging or dangerous, but they are not, cost-free. Thank you. Because if you impose into the Constitution the rule that the minimum wage has to increase at least the inflation rate of past year, that would imply in itself that in the future, all wage negotiations will have a single floor, starting with a single floor. So what this is going to lead to, not in the short term probably, is to less flexibility of an economy, to more wage negotiations thought about in past negotiations. So indexation. That's where Mexico came from in the 80s and 70s. Clearly not, we're not talking about going back to the big inflation problems, but certainly indexation will be an issue. And also, and finally, the pension reform. What López Obrador proposed was to create this pension fund and guarantee Mexicans that they will receive a 100% replacement rate when they retire, below a threshold, 16,000 peso. It doesn't look that bad in the paper, but the problem is that you're creating a long-term liability for Mexican fiscal accounts that no one, absolutely no one knows how is it going to be paid. So this president and the next president will have no issue on funding the pension fund. But yes, definitely, in the next coming decades, Mexico is aging very fast, so we will have to pay the bill somewhere or another. So I would leave it there, but I could go on. But definitely, these are the most worrisome and the ones that are looked at right now.
Perfect.
Not being discussed, by the way, I'm sorry, Maria, not being discussed so far. They are still, the question mark is if this bill will be taken by López Obrador in the final 2 weeks of his government, or will be left for Claudia to decide on what to do with them.
Correct. Yeah, and if they are discussed to see if there's opportunity to have any changes or modifications to the
Yes.
original proposal.
Yes, exactly.
Correct. Yes, Alejandra, so we're going to go with closing remarks because of time. So I will give each of you 2 minutes for final thoughts, and then we will go to Q&A, and then we will end the panel. So go ahead, Alejandra.
I just wanted to comment that something that is not being discussed right now, but will have an implication, has to do with the spillovers of the judiciary reform into economic regulation. Because, I mean, for years, a lot of antitrust enforcement in Mexico was not effective, in part because all cases were lost in the judiciary because economic power had the ability to pressure federal judges. So with a judiciary reform, we might go back into that scenario, specifically in antitrust and energy matters, because we have specialized courts. So the specialized courts will stay the same, but we won't have specialized judges because they'll change them all. And I mean, as we saw in the first panel, we don't know what type of judges will arrive to that position. This is relevant for the US because, for example, when CRE or the Energy Commission started closing the energy market in Mexico, many companies filed amparo, and they're operating today in the energy market because they had those amparos. So that also is at risk. And in general, what we're seeing is that we might be undermining the regulatory agencies, but also the possibility of companies of defending themselves for regulatory matters at the judiciary level.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Alejandra. Thank you very much. Gonzalo, Viri, and final thought, a very, very final comment that you want to do. We're going to have to skip Q&A. So if you want to say anything, now's the moment.
No, I want to say that not only for Mexican citizens, but for Americans, the fact that Mexico can have transparency and accountability is very, very important, because you need, as American, that your partner is accountable and transparent. So if your partner is lying to you all the time, I don't think it's the best for the Americans. So I think this is a bad reform. Just to finish it, this is a bad reform because they are not looking about. It's not looking about how to improve it. And a very concrete example, very quickly, Maria, is that because the reform is bad because they put all institutions on the same bag. In Coneval, for instance, Coneval is now una paraestatal de Sedesol. It's not an autonomous because it is in the Constitution, but in fact it's una paraestatal. So, and it depends on Sedesol, but we're very good at governance. It costs $20 million a year, which is nothing. And moreover, Iviri, those who created Coneval, mainly from the left in 2004, they already won today. they won, and they don't care about disappearing Coneval because they are loyal to the view of the president, López Obrador. And I finally say, I believe that the president will still be here with us on the next 6 years. So I'm not very optimistic.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Viri, do you want to offer?
Yeah, let me be very brief and just mention a few things. So where I describe, based on data, information, and papers, how water concessions work in Mexico and why we need to change them. So I do believe that that's a step forward. In terms of mining concessions, I also believe that that is a step forward because we care about climate change. And this form of mining, in my opinion, if we care about climate change, should not happen anymore. Then in terms of whether the state should be capable of regulating the energy market or not, again, that's an ideological position. I think that many countries have decided yes, including countries like the UK, where actually previously they had a much more independent institution, and now they have decided that it is okay for the state to be, more hands-on on how regulation happens in the energy market, because at the end of the day, it is a very basic good that you want to provide to your citizens. In terms of pension and social programs, it's important to also remember that Mexico has one of the lowest expenses on social programs of the world. So even if López Obrador has tricked us into believing, because he's a magician politician, he has tricked us into believing that he has increased a lot social expenditure, the reality is that when you look at the data, he really hasn't. There has been a change on how social expenditure is distributed, because now it is distributed as cash transfers more than in other forms of social programs. But the total amount of expenditure is still very similar to the beginning of sexennium, and it is still much lower than many other countries. I think that one probably of the reforms that we would need to discuss eventually is a fiscal reform for Mexico, in order for Mexico being capable of increasing expenditure and having much more strong and well-performing institutions. That's unfortunately something that Claudia is not willing to do, neither AMLO has been willing to do, and I do think that's a major area of opportunity. But just arguing that Mexico is overspending, I don't think it is what we observed in the data. And I think I want to stop there for now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Viri. Thank you to all our panelists, all our audience, and the people that tuned in online. We are going to go to the closing remarks of the conference with our co-chair, Ambassador Anthony Wayne, who will be delivering the final comments. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thanks everybody for being with us today. Thanks to the Mexico Institute and all of their partners and their staff, and for all of you who came and participated with us and joined us online. This was a really fascinating exploration of really the breadth and depth of these reforms that are being considered by Mexico. We've heard how complex these reforms are. They are going to have very short-term effects, they're going to have medium-term effects, and they're going to be bringing us long-term effects for a long time, I think, and we'll see. Of course, the Mexican people are the ones who are going to feel most directly these effects, and will have to draw their own judgments. From a point of view of democratic backsliding, I've had a number of my students over the past year do their own independent studies looking at this, and it's been pretty clear that for the past 10 years, Mexico has been sliding backward on a number of measures of democracy as measured by those scholars around the world who look at all democracies and all autocracies and rank everybody and put them together and write analyses. So it's not just about Mexico. And that's why I've had my students look at these broad studies that look at 160 countries, 130 countries, others, and then pull out what people are saying about Mexico. So in a sense, what we've seen over the past several years is not a surprise. It might be sad, it might be encouraging to different people, but it's not a surprise. And so the challenges are really, first and foremost, challenges for Mexico to take on and for Mexicans to decide, and I think that's correct. However, when we look at the other issues that we talked about today, whether they have to do with an investment environment where the United States has over $100 billion worth of investment in the country, where we have such intense cross-border relationships with 1 million people a day crossing this border, not just for commerce, for daily life, for building those relations between countries, where we have criminal activity that is killing tens and thousands of both Mexicans and Americans because of the violence that's created and because of the drug overdoses that are being fed. The United States does have a very serious interest. And to quote somebody's recently, the United States does have standing to raise its concerns and to raise them seriously. And so I think that cluster of issues is in a little bit different area than though we might very much care about democracy in Mexico and liberties in Mexico. That's really Mexicans very much first. But I think when we think about the partnerships across North America, these other issues are shared. And we talked about all of those to a degree, and everybody made both of those points. I'm just trying to pull that out. We heard a lot of very valuable insights. There are a lot of ways to for the United States to deal with some of these challenges, to deal with their partners. There will be a new government in Mexico. I certainly think we should explore dealing with these challenges with that new government. But it's pretty clear from today, the agenda is going to be very different than we might have seen 6 months ago. Well, I won't. Maybe I'll say not very different. It'll be tougher in certain areas. It'll be sharper in certain areas than we saw 6 months ago. But those of us who have worked on Mexico, who know Mexico and the United States well, know that this is a tremendously important relationship for both countries. We have had a few challenges before in this history across North America, and so I'm sure we'll all keep working on it. Certainly the Mexico Institute is going to keep working very hard to find solutions, to point in constructive ways of taking things forward. Because this North American relationship has a tremendous amount of value and a tremendous amount of potential. So let's all keep talking, keep working, looking for new opportunities, and thank you all for being with us today. It's been a great pleasure.